shadow. The sound of waves lapping at the Carthaginian harbor, the soft hum of ancient trade, and the birth.
Imagine a city bathed in the golden light of the Mediterranean sun. This is Carthage, a jewel of North Africa, a bustling hub of trade where ships from across the known world line the harbor, their sails like a forest of white trees. The air hums with a dozen languages, the scent of exotic spices, and the promise of untold riches. For centuries, Carthage has been a titan, its influence stretching from the shores of Iberia to the islands of Sicily. Its people, the descendants of Phoenician explorers, are masters of the sea, their wealth and power rivaled only by the burgeoning republic across the water. Rome. In the year 247 BC, into this vibrant, powerful city, a boy is born. His name is Hannibal, son of Hannibal Barca, a general renowned for his fierce leadership and unyielding spirit. From his earliest days, Hannibal is surrounded by the echoes of war. He grows up listening to tales of Carthage's long and bitter struggle against Rome in the First Punic War, a conflict that cost his people dearly in both treasure and pride. He sees the veterans in the streets, men who fought alongside his father in the rugged mountains of Sicily, their eyes still holding the fire of battle and the sting of a hard-won, yet ultimately frustrating, peace. Hannibal looks at his son and sees not just a child, but the future of Carthage. He sees the embodiment of a promise, a weapon to be forged against the Roman wolf. The peace treaty with Rome is a bitter pill for Carthage to swallow. They've lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and are burdened with heavy reparations. For Hamilcar, this isn't peace. It's a temporary ceasefire, a humiliation that must be avenged. He instills this burning desire for retribution in his young son. The stories Hannibal hears are not bedtime fables, but lessons in strategy, sacrifice, and hatred for the enemy that has humbled his homeland. Picture this: a 9-year-old Hannibal standing before a sacrificial altar with his father. The air is thick with the smoke of offerings to the gods. Hamilcar, about to depart for a new campaign to rebuild Carthaginian power in Hispania, turns to his son. He asks the boy if he wishes to come with him. Young Hannibal, with a fire in his eyes that mirrors his father's, eagerly agrees. But Hamilcar has one condition. He makes Hannibal place his small hand upon the altar and swear a solemn oath. An oath that will define his entire existence, to forever be an enemy of Rome. This moment is the crucible in which the legend of Hannibal is forged. It's a promise made in the shadow of defeat, a vow that will set the course of history for decades to come. As Hannibal sails with his father to the new Carthaginian territories in Spain, he leaves behind the boy and begins his transformation into a soldier. He learns not in a classroom, but on the training grounds and the battlefield. He learns to ride, to fight, to lead. He watches his father, a master of unconventional warfare, subdue a patchwork of fierce Iberian tribes, not just with force, but with diplomacy, respect, and shrewd politics. Hamilcar is building more than just a new province. He's building an army loyal not to the wavering politicians back in Carthage, but to the Barca family, an army that will one day be Hannibal's to command. In these formative years, Hannibal witnesses firsthand the qualities of a great leader. He sees his father's strategic brilliance, his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty, and his relentless determination. These are the lessons that will serve him far better than any scroll or tablet. Tragedy strikes when Hamilcar falls in battle. The command passes to his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who continues the work of consolidating Carthaginian power in Hispania. Hasdrubal is more of a diplomat than a general, but he recognizes the prodigious talent in his young brother. He gives Hannibal increasing responsibilities, allowing him to command the cavalry and lead expeditions. In these skirmishes and campaigns, Hannibal hones his skills. He proves himself to be fearless in the face of danger, quick-witted in the chaos of battle, and beloved by his men, who see in him the spirit of his legendary father. He shares their hardships, eats the same rations, and sleeps on the ground beside them. He's one of them. Then, in 221 BC, Hasdrubal is assassinated, and the moment the army has been waiting for arrives. Without even waiting for confirmation from the government in Carthage, the soldiers, with one voice, proclaimed the 26-year-old Hannibal as their new commander-in-chief. The sleeping lion of Carthage has finally awoken. The boy who swore an oath of eternal enmity towards Rome is now a man, a brilliant and charismatic general at the head of a battle-hardened, fiercely loyal army. Hannibal wastes no time. He spends the next 2 years consolidating his power and pushing the boundaries of Carthaginian influence in Hispania, testing the limits of the treaty with Rome. He knows that a confrontation is inevitable. It is not a matter of if, but when. His target is the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally south of the Ebro River. By attacking it, he is deliberately throwing down the gauntlet. Daring Rome to respond. He knows this act will ignite the flames of a new war, a war he has been preparing for his entire life. The siege of Saguntum is brutal and lasts for 8 months. Hannibal himself is wounded in the fighting, but he never relents. He is sending a clear message to Rome and to the world. Carthage is no longer a humbled power, licking its wounds. Under his command, it is a resurgent force, aggressive and ready to reclaim its destiny. When Saguntum finally falls, the Roman Senate is outraged. They send ambassadors to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over. The Carthaginian government, caught between their brilliant general and the might of Rome, hesitates, but Hannibal has already forced their hand. The choice is made. The Second Punic War has begun, but Hannibal has no intention of fighting a defensive war, waiting for the Roman legions to land in Africa or Spain. His plan is something far more audacious, something no one in Rome could ever anticipate. He will not fight Rome on his terms, in his territory. He will take the war to them. He will bring the fight to Italy itself. This decision sets the stage for one of the most daring military campaigns in all of human history. He gathers his army, a diverse force of Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, and Gauls, prepares for a journey that seems impossible. He plans to march his army, including dozens of war elephants, hundreds of miles over the Pyrenees Mountains, across the treacherous Rhone River, and then, most incredibly of all, over the snow-capped peaks of the Alps. This is a gamble of epic proportions, a feat of logistics and leadership that defies imagination. Many of his own officers think it's madness. The Romans, secure in their belief that the Alps are an impassable barrier, don't even consider it a possibility. They are preparing their armies to invade Spain and Africa, confident they can control where the war is fought. They have no idea that the storm is not coming to them. They are in its path. Hannibal is about to do the unthinkable, and in doing so, he will carve his name into the annals of history, forever remembered as one of Rome's greatest and most feared adversaries. The march has begun. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the past. If you were captivated by the story of Hannibal's early life, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you do and miss the next chapter of this epic saga. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. To truly understand the fire that drove Hannibal Barca, the man who brought Rome to its very knees, we have to go back a generation. We need to meet his father, the formidable Hannibal Barca. This isn't just a family story. It's the origin story of one of history's greatest rivalries. Picture this: the mid-3rd century BCE. The Mediterranean is a chessboard, and the two superpowers, Rome and Carthage, are the players. Hannibal Barca is Carthage's finest general, a man of immense pride, strategic genius, and unwavering loyalty to his city. He is the tip of the spear for Carthaginian ambition. For over 2 decades, he commanded Carthage's forces in the First Punic War, a brutal, sprawling conflict fought primarily at sea and on the island of Sicily. Hamilcar was a master of guerrilla warfare, a brilliant tactician who knew how to get the most out of his men. On the rugged terrain of Sicily, he was a constant thorn in Rome's side, launching raids, holding strategic high ground, and frustrating Roman legions for years. He was audacious, leading his forces from the front, earning the respect and fierce loyalty of his multinational mercenary army, a notoriously difficult feat. For him, victory wasn't just a goal, it was a birthright. He saw Carthage as the rightful master of the Mediterranean, a sophisticated maritime empire whose trading prowess was unmatched. Rome, in his eyes, was a brutish, land-based upstart, an expanding republic whose ambitions directly threatened Carthage's very existence. He fought with the conviction of a man defending not just territory, but a way of life. He believed in Carthaginian supremacy with every fiber of his being. But war, as we know, is unpredictable. The First Punic War was a meat grinder. Despite Hamilcar's brilliance on land, the war's destiny would be decided on the waves. Rome, initially a land power with a negligible navy, did something remarkable. They adapted. They captured a Carthaginian warship, reverse-engineered it, and built a massive fleet of their own. More than that, they innovated. They invented a device called the corvus, a kind of boarding bridge with a heavy spike on the end. This simple but ingenious tool allowed the Romans to turn a sea battle into a land battle. They would ram their ships into Carthaginian vessels, drop the corvus, and send their disciplined legionaries swarming across to overwhelm the Carthaginian sailors. This Roman ingenuity ultimately tipped the scales. At the decisive Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, the newly built Roman fleet, more agile and better men, crushed the Carthaginian navy. The supply lines to Hamilcar's forces in Sicily were severed, starved of resources and support, with no hope of reinforcement. Hamilcar was trapped. The Carthaginian government, exhausted by the long war and facing financial ruin, had no choice but to sue for peace. For Hamilcar, a man who had never been personally defeated in a major land battle, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He was forced to negotiate a surrender. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound personal humiliation. He had to abandon Sicily, an island he had fought tooth and nail for, and agree to a treaty that imposed a crushing indemnity on Carthage. Imagine the scene. The proud general, the Lion of Carthage, forced to sail away from Sicily, leaving the island to his hated Roman rivals. The smoke from burning ships has cleared, but the sting of defeat hangs heavy in the air. This moment is the crucible where Hannibal's destiny is forged. Hamilcar returns to Carthage not as a conquering hero, but as the commander of a defeated army. The peace terms are harsh. Carthage loses Sicily, its first overseas province, and is saddled with a massive war debt that will cripple its economy for years. But the humiliation doesn't end there. A few years later, while Carthage is embroiled in a brutal conflict with its own unpaid mercenaries of war, Hamilcar himself would eventually win for the Statrum, opportunistically seizes the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, and imposes an even larger fine. This act of cynical betrayal was the final straw. For Hamilcar, it was proof that Rome was not an honorable rival, but a rapacious predator that would stop at nothing to expand its power. He saw that peace was just a temporary truce, and that another, more terrible war was inevitable. He resolved that when that war came, Carthage would be ready, and he would ensure his own family, his own bloodline, would be the instrument of Rome's destruction. The seed of vengeance, planted in the fertile ground of humiliation and betrayal, began to grow. Hamilcar channeled his rage and his ambition into a new project, the conquest of Iberia, modern-day Spain. The Spanish peninsula was rich in resources, especially the silver mines that could refill Carthage's empty coffers and fund a new army, an army that could one day march on Rome itself. This is where the legend truly begins. According to the Roman historian Livy, before Hamilcar set out for Spain, he brought his young son, Hannibal, then just 9 years old, to a sacrificial altar in the temple of Balhaman. Picture young Hannibal, his eyes wide, watching his powerful father perform the sacred rites. Hamilcar then turned to his son. He asked Hannibal if he wished to accompany him to Spain and become a soldier. When the boy eagerly agreed, Hamilcar took him by the hand, led him to the altar, and made him swear a solemn oath, an oath that would echo through eternity. He made Hannibal swear that as long as he lived, he would never be a friend of Rome. Think about the weight of that moment. This wasn't just a father's wish. It was a sacred vow, a lifelong mission bestowed upon a child. From that day forward, Hannibal's life had a single, all-consuming purpose: to avenge his father's humiliation, and to break the power of the Roman Republic. This oath became the guiding star of his existence. It shaped his education, his training, and his entire worldview. Hamilcar took his son with him to Spain, not to be sheltered in a palace, but to live among the soldiers, to sleep on the hard ground, to learn the art of war from the ground up. Hannibal grew up in a military camp, surrounded by the sights and sounds of conquest. He learned to ride, to fight, to lead. He watched his father expertly manage alliances with Iberian tribes, wage brutal campaigns, and slowly, methodically, build a new Carthaginian empire from scratch. He saw firsthand Hamilcar's charisma, his strategic brilliance, and his unyielding hatred for Rome. Every lesson, every battle, every conversation was infused with this legacy of vengeance. Hamilcar wasn't just training a soldier, he was forging a weapon. He was passing his own burning ambition, his own personal vendetta, directly into the heart of his son. When Hamilcar eventually fell in battle in Spain, the command passed first to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, and then, upon Hasdrubal's assassination, to the man who had been preparing for this role his entire life, Hannibal Barca. At the age of just 26, Hannibal took command of the Carthaginian army in Spain. He was the living embodiment of his father's legacy. He had inherited not only Hamilcar's strategic mind and tactical genius, but also his deep, personal, and sacredly sworn hatred of Rome. The stage was now set for the Second Punic War. This conflict wouldn't be just a geopolitical struggle for territory or resources. For Hannibal, it was deeply personal. It was the fulfillment of a promise made as a child at a holy altar. It was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. Every decision he would make, from his audacious plan to cross the Alps with elephants to his brilliant tactics at battles like Cannae, was fueled by the memory of his father's defeat and the sacred oath he had sworn. The ghost of Hamilcar Barca would march with Hannibal's army every step of the way, a constant reminder of the debt that had to be paid in Roman blood. The father's loss had become the son's obsession, and that obsession would soon set the world on fire. Thank you so much for watching. We're just getting started on this incredible journey into the life of Hannibal. If you enjoyed this and want to see what happens next, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter. We'll see you in the next video. The fire crackles in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Outside, Carthage is quiet, but inside this home, history is about to be forged. Imagine a young boy, no older than 9, standing before his father. This isn't just any boy, and this is no ordinary father. This is Hannibal Barca, and the man before him is Hamilcar, the Lion of Carthage, a general hardened by war and driven by a singular, burning hatred for Rome. Hamilcar is preparing to depart for Hispania, Morande, Spain. He's making sacrifices to the gods, praying for success in his campaign to rebuild Carthaginian power after the humiliating defeat in the First Punic War. Little Hannibal, full of a child's curiosity and eagerness, tugs at his father's tunic. Wants to go to see the world of soldiers and conquest he's only heard stories about. Hamilcar looks down at his son. He sees not just a child, but the future of his family, the future of Carthage itself. He agrees, but on one condition, a condition that will echo through the ages. He leads Hannibal to the altar, a sacred space where oaths are sworn and destinies are sealed. Place your hand upon the sacrifice, Hamilcar commands, his voice low and intense. Hannibal, small but resolute, does as he's told. His small hand rests upon the offering, feeling the warmth of the recent sacrifice. Then, his father makes him swear. Swear an oath that will define his entire existence. Swear. Hamilcar's voice resonates with the weight of generations of conflict, that you will never be a friend to Rome. Swear that you will be their eternal enemy. In that moment, a boy's playfulness gives way to a man's purpose. Hannibal looks into his father's eyes and repeats the words. The oath is sworn, a promise made not just to his father, but to the gods, to his people, and to himself. This wasn't just a dramatic gesture. It was the planting of a seed of vengeance that would grow into one of the most audacious military campaigns in all of history. Think about the gravity of this moment. A 9-year-old boy, pledging lifelong enmity against the most powerful republic in the world. This oath becomes the guiding star of his life. It fuels his ambition, sharpens his strategic genius, and drives him across seas, mountains, and battlefields. Every decision he makes from this day forward will be viewed through the lens of this single, solemn promise. Hamilcar didn't just ask for loyalty. He instilled a mission. He was grooming his successor, not just to lead armies, but to carry the burden of his own unfinished war. He was passing the torch of hatred, ensuring that the fight against Rome would continue, even after he was gone. And Hannibal, the boy, accepts this legacy without hesitation. This family ritual, this quiet moment by a sacrificial altar, is the true beginning of the Second Punic War. It's not about treaties or borders yet. It's about a deeply personal, deeply felt commitment. It transforms the political rivalry between two great powers into a personal vendetta for one of history's greatest military commanders. The boy who made that promise would grow up to be Rome's worst nightmare. He would cross the Alps with elephants, outwit and annihilate entire Roman armies at battles like Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and the legendary Cannae. He would bring Rome to its knees, all in the name of the oath he swore as a child. So when we talk about Hannibal's incredible journey, his brilliant tactics, and his unyielding determination, we must always remember where it all began. Not on a battlefield, but in a quiet room, with a father's fierce ambition and a son's solemn vow, a boy's oath that would forever change the course of the ancient world. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the lives of history's most compelling figures. We'll see you in the next chapter. Imagine a young boy, not in a classroom filled with books, but in a sprawling military camp, the air thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and the earth-shaking presence of war elephants. This wasn't just any boy. This was Hannibal Barca. And this was his school. Welcome back to our series on the Titans of History. Today, we delve into the formative years of a legend, exploring how a child was forged into one of the greatest military commanders the world has ever known. This is the education of a warrior. From the moment he was old enough to walk, Hannibal's world was a masterclass in warfare. His father, Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general in his own right, ensured his son's education was anything but ordinary. Forget poetry and philosophy for a moment. Hannibal's first lessons were in the harsh realities of a soldier's life. He lived among the men, ate their coarse bread, and listened to their stories of battle, bravery, and loss. He learned to read the mood of an army not from a textbook, but from the murmurs around the campfires. His tutors were not just scholars, but seasoned veterans. One taught him how to read a map, not on a flat table, but by studying the contours of the land itself. How a hill could offer a tactical advantage, how a river could become a deadly trap for the unwary. Another, a grizzled cavalryman, taught him not just how to ride, but how to become one with his horse, to feel its every muscle tense, to anticipate its every move. He learned that a cavalry charge wasn't just about speed. It was about timing, precision, and terrifying, controlled chaos. And then there were the elephants. These colossal beasts were the super weapons of the ancient world. For most, they were a terrifying spectacle. For young Hannibal, they were a part of his daily life. He didn't just see them from a distance. He learned their habits, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He studied how they responded to different handlers, how they reacted in the chaos of a mock battle, and how their immense power could be harnessed to shatter an enemy line. This intimate knowledge would later become one of his most devastating tools on the battlefield. But Hamilcar knew that a great commander needed more than just military skill. He needed a sharp mind, capable of outthinking his opponent long before the first spear was thrown. So, Hannibal was also immersed in the study of history, strategy, and logistics. Greek tutors were brought in to teach him about Alexander the Great's campaigns, Scipio, Africanissus, Roman tactics, and the political intricacies of the Mediterranean world. He learned that an army marches on its stomach, and that the line of supply is as vital as the battle line itself. He was taught to anticipate his enemy's moves, to devise feints within feints, and to cultivate a mind that was always 3 steps ahead. This dual education, the rugged practica school of the soldier and the intellectual, strategic school of the scholar, created a unique blend of skills. He possessed the physical toughness to endure the same hardships as his men, earning their respect and unwavering loyalty. He could sleep on the cold, hard ground one night and debate complex political theories the next. This wasn't just about learning facts. It was about cultivating a mindset. It was about endurance, both physical and mental. It was about understanding that victory is forged, not just in the heat of battle, but in the years of relentless preparation. Think about the psychological conditioning. Growing up, Hannibal was constantly reminded of Carthage's bitter defeat to Rome in the First Punic War. His father, Hamilcar, famously made him swear an oath at the altar of Baal Haman, an oath of eternal enmity towards Rome. This wasn't just a dramatic gesture. It was the central pillar of his upbringing. Every lesson, every drill, every hardship was framed by this singular purpose. It gave him a focus, a driving force that would fuel his ambition for the rest of his life. He wasn't just learning to be a general. He was being molded into the instrument of Carthaginian vengeance. He learned the art of leadership not from a manual, but by observing his father. He saw how Hamilcar inspired devotion, how he shared his soldiers' rations and remembered their names. Hannibal learned that true authority isn't demanded. It's earned. It's earned through shared struggle, mutual respect, and a clear, unwavering vision. He saw that a commander must be the first to charge and the last to retreat, that his own courage had to be the standard for the entire army. This education also instilled in him a remarkable adaptability. Living in Hispania, a land of diverse tribes and rugged terrain, he was exposed to various fighting styles. He learned the guerrilla tactics of the Celtiberi, the disciplined formations of his own Carthaginian regulars, and the raw power of Gallic warriors. He wasn't dogmatic in his approach. Instead, he became a master of synthesis, capable of blending different military traditions into a cohesive and deadly fighting force. He understood that a successful army was like a well-crafted mosaic, with each piece contributing its unique strength to the overall picture. So, when we look at Hannibal crossing the Alps, we aren't just seeing a daring military maneuver. We are seeing the culmination of his entire life's education. His understanding of logistics made the impossible journey possible. His bond with his men ensured they would follow him through snow and starvation. His knowledge of strategy allowed him to anticipate and outwit the Roman legions sent to stop him. And his familiarity with elephants allowed him to deploy these living tanks to terrifying effect on Italian soil. The boy who played among soldiers had become their master. The student of strategy was now its greatest practitioner. The child who swore an oath of vengeance was about to shake the Roman Republic to its very foundations. The education of this warrior was complete. Now, the real test was about to begin. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into Hannibal's early life. It's in these formative years that the seeds of greatness were sown. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history as most compelling figures. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where Hannibal unleashes his genius upon an unsuspecting Italy. We'll see you next time. All right, let's dive into Chapter 5. Carthage's new hope in Spain. After the humiliating defeat in the First Punic War and the brutal mercenary war, Carthage was on its knees. Its treasury was empty, its pride was wounded, and its Mediterranean ambitions seemed shattered. But one man refused to accept this fate: Hannibal Barca. He saw a path to redemption, not by challenging Rome directly in the seas they now controlled, but by looking westward, to the vast, untapped potential of the Iberian Peninsula Modranda, Spain and Portugal. Why Spain? It was a land rich in resources, especially silver, which Carthage desperately needed to refill its coffers. More importantly, it was teeming with fierce, independent tribes: Celts, Iberians, Celti-Iberians, warriors who could be recruited to rebuild Carthage's military strength. Hamilcar's vision was audacious: to create a new Carthaginian empire in Spain, a power base from which to one day challenge Rome again. In 237 BC, Hannibal Barca landed in Iberia. He didn't arrive with a massive invasion force. Instead, he used a brilliant mix of diplomacy, bribery, and targeted military action. He wasn't just conquering, he was building. He founded the city of Acre-Luque, or White Rock, a strategic hub for his operations. He forged alliances with local chieftains, often by marrying his daughters into their families, weaving a complex web of loyalties. He subjugated tribes that resisted, but he always preferred a treaty to a battle. For 9 years, Hamilcar tirelessly expanded Carthaginian influence, securing silver mines and recruiting the best local fighters into his army. He was creating a self-sufficient dominion, a personal fiefdom loyal to the Barca family as much as to Carthage itself. It was during this time that he brought his young son, Hannibal, to Spain. The story goes that before they left Carthage, Hamilcar made the 9-year-old Hannibal swear an oath at an altar, a solemn vow of eternal hatred towards Rome. Whether this event is historical fact or a later embellishment, it perfectly captures the spirit of the Barcid mission. Hamilcar was not just building an empire, he was grooming his successor, instilling in him the same burning desire for vengeance. Then, in 228 BC, disaster struck. During a siege, Hamilcar was killed in battle. The grand project seemed to be in jeopardy. The command of the army in Spain now passed to his son, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hasdrubal was a different kind of leader. Where Hamilcar was a general, Hasdrubal was a statesman. He preferred diplomacy and consolidation over constant expansion. He focused on solidifying the gains Hamilcar had made, and his greatest achievement was the founding of a magnificent new capital, Carthage, which the Romans would later call Carthago Nova, or New Carthage. Today, it's the city of Cartagena, in Spain. This city became the administrative and economic heart of Carthaginian Iberia, a symbol of their power and permanence in the region. Hasdrubal also understood the importance of managing the relationship with Rome. The Romans were watching the Carthaginian expansion in Spain with growing concern. To avoid another premature conflict, Hasdrubal negotiated the Ebro Treaty with Rome in 226 BC. This agreement established the Ebro River as the boundary of their respective spheres of influence. Carthage agreed not to expand its military operations north of the Ebro, and implicitly, Rome agreed not to interfere with Carthaginian activities to the south. It was a pragmatic move that bought Carthage precious time. While Hasdrubal was managing the politics of the new empire, a young Hannibal was learning the art of command. He served as a cavalry officer under his brother-in-law, quickly distinguishing himself. He was incredibly popular with the soldiers. The ancient historian Livy tells us that the veteran soldiers saw in him the reincarnation of the young Hannibal. They saw the same fire in his eyes, the same energy, the same daring leadership. Hannibal wasn't just a privileged noble. He lived with his men, ate the same food, and fought alongside them in the front lines. He earned their respect through his courage, his tactical brilliance, and his genuine care for their welfare. He learned the terrain of Spain, he understood the strengths and weaknesses of the various Iberian tribes, and he mastered the combat arms tactics that his father had pioneered. For 7 years, Hannibal honed his skills under Hasdrubal's tutelage. He was no longer just the boy who swore an oath. He was a seasoned commander, respected and loved by a powerful, veteran army. The stage was being set for a dramatic shift in power. Then, in 221 BC, history repeated itself. Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a vengeful Celt. The army in Spain needed a new leader. There was no hesitation. The soldiers, who had watched Hannibal grow from a boy into a brilliant commander, unanimously proclaimed him as their new general. The government back in Carthage, faced with the overwhelming support of their most important army, had little choice but to ratify the decision. At the age of just 26, Hannibal Barca took supreme command. He inherited a powerful army, a wealthy province, and a single, all-consuming mission passed down from his father: the destruction of Rome. Unlike Hannibal had no interest in diplomacy or peaceful coexistence. The Ebro Treaty was, in his eyes, merely a temporary truce. For the next 2 years, he moved decisively to complete the conquest of the remaining territories south of the Ebro, pushing his forces to their limit and testing his new strategies. His target was a city called Saguntum. Saguntum was a tricky case. It was located south of the Ebro, technically within the Carthaginian sphere of influence. However, in the years prior, it had formed an alliance with Rome. Hannibal saw this as a Roman provocation, a violation of the spirit of the Ebro Treaty. For him, Saguntum was the perfect pretext to ignite the war he had been preparing for his entire life. The Romans, on the other hand, saw their alliance with Saguntum as a crucial check on Carthaginian power. It was a diplomatic tripwire. In 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to the city fiercely resisted, holding out for 8 long months, hoping for Roman aid that never came. Rome sent him boys. They protested. They threatened. But they did not send an army. When the city finally fell, Hannibal showed no mercy. The conflict over a single Spanish city had lit the fuse. Rome sent an embassy to Carthage, demanding that they hand over Hannibal for breaking the peace. The Carthaginian Senate refused. The lead Roman envoy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, famously held up 2 folds of his toga and declared, "Here I bring you peace and war. Take what you will." The Carthaginians defiantly shouted back, "Give us whichever you please." Fabius dropped the fold containing war. The Second Punic War had begun, but Hannibal was not going to wait for the Romans to come to him. He was about to do something no one thought possible, a move so audacious it would echo through history for millennia. He was going to take the war to Rome's doorstep. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll follow Hannibal on his legendary march across the Alps. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the Punic Wars. We're at a pivotal moment, a single spark that will ignite one of the greatest conflicts in ancient history. The year is 219 BC. The stage is set on the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain. Here, 2 colossal powers, Rome and Carthage, are on a collision course, and at the center of it all is a city named Now, remember the Ebro Treaty. It was supposed to create a clear boundary, a line in the sand, with the Ebro River separating Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence. North of the river was for Rome, south was for Carthage. Simple, right? Well, not exactly. The problem was Saguntum. This city, a prosperous trading hub, was located south of the Ebro, squarely in Carthaginian territory, but it had formed an alliance with Rome. It was a Roman friend in a Carthaginian world, a diplomatic anomaly that was a disaster waiting to happen. Enter Hannibal Barca. He's now the commander of the Carthaginian forces in Spain, inheriting not just his father's army, but also his deep-seated vow of enmity towards Rome. Hannibal is young, brilliant, and ambitious. He sees Roman expansionism for what it is, a relentless crawl for dominance. He looks at Saguntum's alliance with Rome not as a simple diplomatic test, but as a deliberate provocation, a Roman dagger aimed at the heart of Carthaginian Spain. To Hannibal, Saguntum was a test. Would Rome defend its ally deep within his territory? Or would they let it fall? He decided to force their hand. In 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. This wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a statement. He was challenging Rome's authority and testing the limits of their power. The Saguntines, trusting in their mighty ally, prepared for a defense. They sent desperate pleas to Rome, expecting legions to march to their rescue. The siege was brutal and unforgiving. Hannibal, a master of siege warfare, employed everything in his arsenal. Towering siege engines, relentless assaults, and cunning tactics to breach the city's formidable walls. The people of Saguntum fought back with incredible bravery, holding out for an astonishing 8 months. They endured starvation, constant bombardment, and the sheer psychological terror of a prolonged siege, all the while looking to the horizon for Roman sails that never appeared. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate was paralyzed by debate. What should they do? Sending an army to Saguntum meant declaring war on Carthage. It was a massive step. Some argued for diplomacy, others for immediate military intervention. They sent envoys to Hannibal, demanding he halt the siege. He essentially ignored them. They sent envoys to Carthage, demanding they hand Hannibal over for his aggression. The Carthaginian government, buoyed by Hannibal's successes and resentful of Roman arrogance, refused. The back and forth continued. But while the politicians talked, the people of Saguntum died. After 8 grueling months, the city's defenses finally crumbled. What happened next was a tragedy. Rather than surrender to Hannibal, Many of the leading citizens of Saguntum chose to die. They gathered their wealth, set it ablaze in the city square, and then threw themselves into the flames. Hannibal's army stormed the city, and a terrible slaughter ensued. Saguntum, the loyal ally of Rome, was utterly destroyed. Its fall was a catastrophic failure of Roman foreign policy. They had made a promise, and they had broken it. The news of Saguntum's destruction sent shockwaves through the Roman world. The time for debate was over. A Roman delegation, led by the elder statesman Quintus Fabius Maximus, was dispatched to Carthage one last time. They entered the Carthaginian Senate and laid out their final ultimatum. Fabius, holding a fold in his toga, famously declared, "Here I bring you peace and war. Take what you will." The Carthaginian senators defiantly shouted back, "Give us whichever you please." Fabius then shook out the fold and proclaimed, "Then we give you war." And with those words, the Second Punic War officially began. The fall of Saguntum was the spark. It was the casus belli, the formal reason for war. But the real causes ran much deeper. Decades of rivalry, broken treaties, and the clashing ambitions of two empires. For Hannibal, the capture of Saguntum was more than just a victory. It was the launching pad for his grand design. He secured his rear base in Spain, gathered immense wealth from the city to fund his campaign, and solidified his authority over his army. He had successfully provoked the war he wanted on his own terms. And now, with Spain under his control and Rome officially his enemy, Hannibal prepared to do the unthinkable. He wouldn't wait for Rome to bring the war to him in Africa or Spain. He would take the war to them, to Tyre, to Italy itself. He gathered his legendary army, a diverse force of Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, and Gauls, and his famous war elephants. He was about to embark on one of the most audacious and legendary military campaigns in all of human history. Crossing the Alps to invade Italy, the siege of Saguntum was over. But the story of Hannibal was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. The next chapter of this incredible story will see Hannibal's epic march across the mountains, a feat that would terrify Rome and etch his name into history forever. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we re-embarking on one of the most audacious military campaigns ever conceived, Hannibal's impossible journey across the Alps. It's a story of ambition, suffering, and sheer, indomitable will. After securing his base in Spain, Hannibal Barca turned his gaze toward the heart of his enemy, Rome itself. But he wouldn't take the easy sea route. No, Hannibal chose the path of legend, a land route that would take him and his massive army through hostile territory and over the most formidable natural barrier in Europe. Our chapter begins in 218 BC, Hannibal, with an army of nearly 100,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and his famous war elephants, sets out from New Carthage. The first major obstacle: the Pyrenees Mountains. This wasn't just a geographical challenge. The mountain tribes were fierce and unwilling to grant passage. Hannibal had to fight his way through, a brutal foreshadowing of what was to come. He left a significant force to guard the passes and pushed onward. But the cost was already mounting. Thousands of his less committed Spanish troops, daunted by the prospect of crossing the Alps, deserted. Hannibal, ever the pragmatist, allowed them to leave, preferring a smaller, more dedicated force over a large, unwilling one. With the Pyrenees behind him, Hannibal marched into Gaul, modern-day France. Here, his challenge was less about terrain and more about diplomacy and speed. The Romans had allies among the Gallic tribes, and a slow-moving Carthaginian army would be an easy target. Hannibal needed to move fast. He used a mix of gold and intimidation, bribing some tribes for safe passage and supplies, while swiftly crushing others who dared to stand in his way. He outmaneuvered a Roman army sent to intercept him at the Rhine River, accomplishing a brilliant and difficult river crossing with his entire force, including the elephants. Imagine the sight. Massive barges and rafts, with terrified elephants trumpeting as they were ferried across the wide, fast-flowing river. It was a logistical masterpiece, that left the Romans baffled. Realizing too late that Hannibal wasn't heading for a coastal fight, he was aiming for the Alps. Now, the true test began. As autumn set in, Hannibal and his dwindling army reached the foothills of the Alps. The army that had left Spain was now smaller, but more hardened. They looked up at the jagged, snow-dusted peaks. A wall of rock and ice, separating them from their goal. The local Gallic tribes, seeing a vulnerable, treasure-laden army, launched relentless guerrilla attacks. They ambushed the long Carthaginian column in narrow gorges, rolling boulders down from the cliffs above. Hannibal, a brilliant tactician, was forced to fight a different kind of war. He used his light infantry and cavalry to scout ahead and secure the high ground, often fighting brutal skirmishes just to make it through another pass. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a man, let alone a baggage train and terrified elephants. Animals and men slipped from the icy tracks, plunging thousands of feet into the chasms below. The ascent was a nightmare. The cold was a relentless enemy. Soldiers from the warm climates of Africa and Spain were unprepared for the biting winds and freezing temperatures. Snow began to fall, covering the already treacherous paths and hiding deadly crevasses. Food was scarce. The army was starving, weak, and demoralized. The elephants, symbols of Carthaginian power, suffered immensely. Many succumbed to the cold, the lack of fodder, and the terrifyingly narrow ledges. It's a testament to Hannibal's leadership that the army didn't simply disintegrate. He was always there, sharing his soldiers' hardships, encouraging them, and reminding them of the prize that lay ahead. The fertile, wealthy plains of Italy, and the chance to bring Rome to its knees. After 9 grueling days of climbing, they reached the summit. The view was both breathtaking and heartbreaking. Below them, stretching out to the horizon, was Italy. Hannibal gathered his exhausted men. Pointing eastward, he delivered one of history's most famous speeches, telling them they were now scaling not just the walls of Italy, but the walls of Rome itself. He promised them rest, food, and riches. It was a moment of renewed hope, a flicker of light in the frozen darkness. But their ordeal was far from over. The descent proved to be even more dangerous than the ascent. The Italian side of the Alps is steeper, and the snow and ice made the paths a slick, deadly slide. A fresh, heavy snowfall had covered the old track, and the new snow offered no grip. Men and animals lost their footing, triggering small avalanches that swept away entire sections of the column. At one point, they found their path completely blocked by a landslide. Turning back was not an option. Here, Hannibal's engineering genius came to the fore. According to the historian Livy, they cleared the snow, then built a massive fire on the rock face. Once the rock was glowing hot, they doused it with sour wine or vinegar. The sudden change in temperature caused the rock to crack and crumble, allowing his men to chisel out a new path, wide enough for the baggage animals and the few remaining elephants. It was an incredible feat of engineering, accomplished by a starving, freezing army on a mountainside. After 3 more days of torturous descent, they finally emerged from the mountains and stumbled onto the plains of northern Italy. The impossible journey was complete, but the cost was staggering. Of the massive army that had left Spain, fewer than 30,000 men remained. More than half his force had perished in the mountains. Only a handful of his war elephants had survived the ordeal. He had emerged, but as a shadow of his former strength. Yet, Hannibal had triumphed. He had done what the Romans believed to be impossible. He had brought a foreign army to their doorstep, not by sea, but over the frozen roof of the world. This audacious feat struck terror into the heart of the Roman Republic and set the stage for one of the greatest military showdowns in all of history. Hannibal was in Italy, and the Second Punic War had truly begun. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible part of Hannibal's story. It's a powerful reminder of what human beings can endure and achieve against all odds. If you found this journey as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where Hannibal unleashes his fury on the legions of Rome. We'll see you next time. Imagine, for a moment, the feeling of that first step. After weeks of unimaginable hardship, of battling not just hostile tribes but the very mountains themselves, Hannibal's men finally felt soft earth beneath their feet. The air, thick and rich, was no longer the thin, biting cold of the high Alps. They had made it. They were in Italy. The sight that greeted them was a world away from the frozen hell they had just endured. Before them stretched the vast, fertile plains of the Po Valley. It was a land of promise, a land of plenty, but for the soldiers, it was more than that. It was a symbol of their survival. They had stared into the abyss and had not blinked. They had conquered the unconquerable. Yet, this was no time for celebration. The army was a shadow of its former self. Look at them. Gaunt, frostbitten. Their uniforms in tatters. The proud force that had left Spain was now a haggard collection of survivors. More than half their number, and almost all of their precious elephants, were gone, lost to the unforgiving peaks. Hannibal knew the toll had been immense. He could see it in the haunted eyes of his veterans. Men who had faced down Roman legions but were nearly broken by snow and ice. The horses that remained were skeletal, barely able to stand. Morale was dangerously low. Hannibal, ever the master of psychology, knew he had to act fast. He gathered his weary troops. He didn't offer them empty platitudes or false promises. Instead, he pointed towards the horizon, towards the heart of Italy. He spoke of the riches that lay ahead, the fields ripe for plunder, the cities waiting to be taken. He reminded them of their purpose, of the oath he had sworn to his father, to never be a friend to Rome. This wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war for their very existence, for vengeance against an arrogant republic that had humiliated Carthage. He painted a vivid picture of victory. The worst is behind us, he might have declared, his voice ringing with conviction. The Alps were but the walls of Italy. Now that we have breached them, the path to Rome itself lies open. He spoke to the Gauls among them, promising them liberation from Roman rule. He spoke to his Carthaginians and Iberians, promising them glory and wealth beyond their wildest dreams. It was a masterful performance. He breathed fire back into their souls, transforming despair into a burning desire for revenge. Slowly, the exhausted men began to stand taller. The glint returned to their eyes. They were no longer just survivors. They were conquerors. Meanwhile, in Rome, the news arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. Hannibal was in Italy. It was impossible. The Senate had dispatched its legions to Spain and Sicily, confident that the war would be fought far from home. They had considered the Alps an impassable barrier, a natural fortress gifted by the gods. The idea that an entire army could cross them, especially in winter, was dismissed as pure fantasy. Panic began to ripple through the city. Senators debated in hushed, urgent tones. How could their intelligence have been so wrong? The formidable Scipio, who was supposed to be confronting Hannibal in Spain, was now scrambling to return his entire strategy in ruins. The Roman people, so accustomed to victory and the security of their homeland, were suddenly faced with an enemy at their doorstep, an enemy led by a man who seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The shock was profound. This wasn't some distant colonial skirmish. This was an invasion. The boogeyman they told their children about was real, and he was marching through their backyard. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was he a madman or a genius? Did he command supernatural forces? The name Hannibal, once a distant threat, was now whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging awe on the streets of Rome. Back in the Po Valley, Hannibal didn't give the Romans time to recover from their shock. He knew his army needed rest and, more importantly, reinforcements and supplies. The local Gallic tribes, long oppressed by Roman expansion, were watching him. They were hesitant, unsure if this foreign general was a liberator or just another conqueror. Hannibal understood that he needed to prove his strength, to show them that he was a viable alternative to Roman rule. His first target was the Taurini, a Gallic tribe allied with Rome. When they refused to join him, Hannibal wasted no time. He laid siege to their main settlement, and in just 3 days, he stormed the city. The message was brutal and clear. Join me, and you will have your freedom. Oppose me, and you will be annihilated. This act of calculated ruthlessness worked. Other Gallic tribes, seeing both his power and his willingness to fight their Roman masters, began to flock to his banner. Thousands of fresh, eager warriors swelled his depleted ranks. Food, horses, and vital local knowledge flowed into his camp. The army was being reborn. News of this first, swift victory sent another shockwave towards Rome. It confirmed their worst fears. Hannibal was not just passing through. He was organized. He was ruthless. And he was gaining local support. The Roman commander in the region, Publius Cornelius Scipio, finally arrived with his legions. He was a proud, capable general, but he fundamentally underestimated his opponent. He viewed Hannibal as a barbarian leader of a ragged mob, exhausted from their Alpine crossing. He expected a quick, decisive battle that would crush the Carthaginian upstart and restore Roman honor. The two armies finally met near the Ticinus River. It wasn't a full-scale battle, but a cavalry skirmish. Scipio, leading from the front, as was the Roman way, charged forward, expecting his horsemen to sweep aside the enemy. He was met by Hannibal's elite Numidian cavalry. The Numidians were masters of hit-and-run tactics, riding without saddles or bridles, seemingly a part of their horses. They swirled around the more rigid Roman formation, unleashing volleys of javelins before melting away. In the ensuing chaos, Scipio himself was gravely wounded, saved only by the quick thinking of his young son. But the future Scipio of the Roman cavalry broke and fled. It was a small engagement, but its psychological impact was enormous. The Romans, who considered their legions invincible, had been defeated in their very first encounter with Hannibal on Italian soil. Their commander was wounded, and their confidence was shattered. For Hannibal, the victory at Ticinus was a crucial turning point. It proved to his new Gallic allies that he could beat the Romans. It proved to his own men that their suffering in the Alps had not been in vain. And it proved to Rome that the war they had so casually started had now become a desperate struggle for their own survival. The descent from the mountains was complete. The stage was set. The greatest military genius of the age was now unleashed in the heart of his enemy's territory, and the Roman Republic would be shaken to its very foundations. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through history. If you've enjoyed this chapter of Hannibal's saga, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. The road to Cannae is paved with blood and genius, and you won't want to miss a single step. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through the Second Punic War. Today, we're diving into one of Hannibal Barca's most brilliant and brutal military masterstrokes, the Battle of the Trebia River. This wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare, environmental manipulation, and tactical genius. It was Hannibal's first major confrontation with the Roman legions on Italian soil, and the outcome would send shockwaves through the Republic. Picture the scene. It's the heart of winter, December 218 BC. The air is bitterly cold, and a biting wind whips across the plains of northern Italy. On one side of the Trebia River, you have Hannibal's Carthaginian army, a diverse force of Iberians, Gauls, and his elite Numidian cavalry. They are veterans of a grueling Alpine crossing, weary but fiercely loyal to their commander. On the other side, you have the confident, perhaps overconfident, Roman army under the command of Consul Tiberius Sempronius. Longus is eager for glory, itching for a decisive battle to crush the Carthaginian upstart, once and for all. And Hannibal? He knew this. He counted on it. Hannibal's plan began not on the battlefield, but in the mind of his opponent. He knew the Romans were disciplined, but also predictable. He also knew that Longus was ambitious and easily provoked. So, the night before the battle, Hannibal set his trap. Under the cover of darkness, he sent his younger brother Mago, with 2,000 elite soldiers, a mix of infantry and cavalry, to hide in a concealed ravine, a place overgrown with reeds and brush along the riverbank. They were his secret weapon, his ace in the hole, waiting silently in the freezing cold for their moment. As dawn broke, the real performance began. Hannibal ordered his light Numidian cavalry to cross the icy Trebia River and harass the Roman camp. They galloped up to the Roman outposts, hurling insults and javelins, daring them to come out and fight. Inside the Roman camp, chaos erupted. The Numidians were the perfect irritant. Sempronius Longus, awakened by the commotion, and his pride stung, saw red. Without consulting his more cautious colleague Scipio, he ordered his entire army to form up and give chase. This was his first mistake, and it was exactly what Hannibal had anticipated. The Roman legions, roused from their sleep, scrambled into formation. Crucially, they did so without having their morning meal, hungry, cold, and still half asleep. They plunged into the Trebia River to pursue the seemingly fleeing Numidian. The water was chest-high and bone-chillingly cold. Imagine the shock to their systems. By the time the 40,000 Roman soldiers emerged on the other side, they were soaked, shivering uncontrollably, and their hands were so numb they could barely grip their weapons. Their energy was already sapped before a single sword had been swung in earnest. In stark contrast, Hannibal's army was well prepared. He had made sure his men were well fed, warmed by campfires, and had even rubbed their bodies with oil to insulate them from the cold. As the frozen Roman lines stumbled onto the plain, they were met by the sight of the Carthaginian army, fresh, organized, and ready for battle. Hannibal had carefully arranged his forces. His infantry formed a long, solid line in the center, with his Gallic allies positioned right in the middle. His superior cavalry and his mighty war elephants were placed on the flanks. The battle began. The Roman light infantry, the velites, were quickly overwhelmed and fell back. Then the main lines of heavy infantry crashed together. It was a brutal, grinding fight. The Roman legionaries at the center were tough and disciplined, even in their miserable state. They pushed hard against Hannibal's Gallic infantry, slowly gaining ground. For a moment, it might have looked like Roman grit could overcome Hannibal's clever setup, but this was all part of the plan. Hannibal wasn't trying to win in the center. He was winning on the wings. On both flanks, Hannibal's cavalry, led by his best commanders, shattered their Roman counterparts. The Roman horsemen were outnumbered and outclassed. They broke and fled. This left the Roman infantry's sides completely exposed. The Carthaginian cavalry and the war elephants didn't just chase the fleeing horsemen. They wheeled around and slammed into the vulnerable flanks of the Roman legions. Now, the Romans were being attacked from the front and from both sides. Their formation began to buckle under the immense pressure. And then, just as the Roman line was on the verge of collapse, Hannibal sprung his final, devastating trap. On is signal. Mago and his 2,000 hidden soldiers burst from their hiding place in the ravine and charged into the rear of the Roman army. The surprise was absolute. Panic erupted. Attacked from all four sides, the Roman formation disintegrated completely. What was a battle became a massacre. Surrounded, freezing, and exhausted, the legionaries were cut down by the thousands. Only a small portion of the Roman center, about 10,000 men who had punched through Hannibal's goals early on, managed to stay in formation and fight their way out of the encirclement, eventually escaping to the safety of a nearby town. But for the rest of the army, there was no escape. Thousands were killed on the field, and many more drowned trying to retreat back across the freezing river. Out of an army of over 40,000, Rome lost more than half its men. Hannibal's losses were minimal, mostly among the Gallic troops he had strategically placed in the center to absorb the initial Roman charge. The Battle of the Trebia was a stunning victory for Hannibal. He didn't just defeat the Romans, he psychologically dismantled them. He used the weather as a weapon, he used his enemy's pride against them, and he used a perfectly timed ambush to deliver the killing blow. The news of this disaster terrified Rome. A consular army had been annihilated on Italian soil. The unstoppable Carthaginian general, who had crossed the Alps, was now proven to be just as deadly on the battlefield. The stage was set for an even greater conflict, as Rome scrambled to deal with the genius who was now at their doorstep. Trebia was just the beginning of Hannibal's legendary Italian campaign. Thank you so much for watching. If you've found this deep dive into ancient military strategy as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of history's greatest commanders. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore Hannibal's next brilliant move against the might of Rome. We'll see you next time. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Second Punic War. If you thought Hannibal's Alpine crossing was the peak of his audacity, buckle up. Today, we journey to the shores of Lake Trasimene, the setting for one of the most brilliant and brutal military traps ever sprung. This is where Hannibal, the master strategist, lays a snare so perfect, so devastating, that it will echo through the annals of warfare for millennia. Let's set the scene. It's the year to 17 BC. Hannibal is descended from the Alps, his army weathered but unbroken. He has outmaneuvered one Roman consul, Scipio, at the Ticinus River, and then, alongside his Gallic allies, shattered a combined Roman force at the Trebius. Rome is reeling, shocked that this Carthaginian upstart has not only invaded their homeland, but is now running rampant through northern Italy. The Senate, in a state of near panic, appoints a new consul to deal with the threat, Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius is a different breed of Roman leader, a plebeian, a man of the people. He's known for his aggressive, headstrong nature. He loathes the cautious tactics of his predecessors and is burning with a desire to crush Hannibal and restore Roman honor. He sees Hannibal not as a strategic genius but as a barbarian marauder, and he's determined to chase him down and force a decisive battle. This fiery ambition, this overconfidence, is the first key ingredient in the disaster to come. Hannibal, a keen judge of character, studies his new opponent and knows exactly which buttons to push. To lure Flaminius into his trap, Hannibal does something utterly provocative. Instead of marching directly on Rome, he bypasses Flaminius's army and begins a campaign of calculated destruction through Etruria. This region is one of the most fertile and wealthy in Italy. Hannibal's forces burn farms, plunder villages, and create a trail of smoke and chaos, visible for miles. For Flaminius, this is an unbearable insult. He's supposed to be the protector of Italy, yet here is the enemy, feasting on the heartland under his very nose. His officers and advisors urge caution, begging him to wait for his fellow consul and combine their forces. But Flaminius won't listen. His pride is wounded, his patience gone. He orders his legions to pack up and give chase. The bait has been taken. Hannibal now leads the Romans on a merry chase, always staying just ahead. He guides them towards a very specific location he has scouted meticulously, the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. This place is a natural death trap. To the south, the vast, shimmering lake. To the north, a line of steep, wooded hills that curve around the shore. And crucially, a narrow path runs between the hills and the water, accessed by a tight defile on the western end, and exiting through a slightly wider plain to the east. It's a bottleneck, a corridor of doom. As dusk falls, Hannibal marshes his army through the defile and sets up his camp on a hill at the far eastern end, clearly visible to anyone entering the valley. He wants Flaminius to see it, to think his target is just ahead, within reach. But under the cloak of darkness, Hannibal executes his master. He sends the bulk of his army as veteran infantry, his Gallic allies, and his formidable cavalry back along the route, hiding them in the forests and ravines of the hillsides overlooking the narrow path. They are positioned along the entire length of the pass, an army poised in absolute silence, waiting for the dawn. The morning of June 21st arrives, shrouded in a thick, dense fog rolling off the lake. This fog is the final piece of Hannibal's puzzle. It blankets the valley, reducing visibility to just a few feet. It masks the hills, concealing the thousands of soldiers lying in wait. For the Romans, it's just a morning mist. For Hannibal, it's a tactical weapon. Driven by his single-minded pursuit, Flaminius orders his army to break camp at first light. Without sending out proper scouts, a catastrophic era, the entire Roman force, some 30,000 strong, marches straight into the defile. They enter in a long, disorganized column, more a line of march than a battle formation, squeezed between the invisible hills and the unseen lake. They can hear the sounds of Hannibal, escamp ahead and are eager to close the distance and finally force the fight they so desperately want. They have no idea. They've just marched into their own tomb. The head of the Roman column eventually reaches the wider plain at the eastern end and begins to deploy, expecting to engage Hannibal's camp. But then, it happens. A trumpet blast echoes from the hills. It's the signal. All along the northern ridge, from the rear of the Roman column to its very front, Hannibal's army erupts from the mist. Imagine the sheer terror. One moment, you're marching through a quiet, foggy valley. The next, the world explodes. Gallic warriors scream down the slopes to your left. Spanish and Libyan infantry crash into your flank. And most terrifyingly, the Carthaginian cavalry, having sealed the western entrance behind you, smashes into your rear. The Romans are trapped. There is nowhere to run. The lake is to their right, and an entire army is descending upon them from the left, front, and back. What follows is not a battle, it's a slaughter. The Roman legions, caught completely off guard and in a marching column, have no space to form their famous maniples. They can't create a battle line. They can't even see the enemy until they are upon them. Men are cut down where they stand, fighting in small, isolated pockets of desperation. The discipline that made the Roman army so formidable completely evaporates in the face of chaos, surprise, and terror. Flaminius, realizing the horrific totality of the trap, rides desperately through the mayhem, trying to rally his men, but it's hopeless. He is eventually cornered and killed by a Gallic horseman, a symbolic end to his reckless campaign. With their general dead and the command structure shattered, the Roman resistance crumbles. Many soldiers, in a blind panic, throw themselves into Lake Trasimene, trying to swim to safety. But weighed down by their armor, most of them drown. Those who make it to the other side are captured. In just 3 hours, the Roman army is annihilated. Of the 30,000 men who marched into that valley, 15,000 are killed. Another 15,000 are taken prisoner. Hannibal, by contrast, loses only around 1,500 men, mostly Gauls, who bore the brunt of the initial charge. The Battle of Lake Trasimene remains, to this day, the largest ambush in military history in terms of numbers of men involved. The news of this disaster sends a shockwave through Rome more powerful than any earthquake. When the praetor finally addresses the crowd in the forum, his words are stark and chilling. We have been defeated in a great battle. The city descends into mourning. The gates are barred, the walls are manned, and a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, is appointed to handle the crises. The strategy of direct confrontation has failed spectacularly. Rome is now fighting for its very survival. Hannibal's victory at Lake Trasimene is a pure testament to his genius. He perfectly exploited the terrain, the weather, and, most importantly, the psychology of his opponent. He proved that battles are not just won by strength, but by intellect, by patience, and by the art of deception. He had brought the unshakable Roman Republic to its knees. But the question remained, with the road to Rome now open, what would he do next? Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible story. The drama is far from over. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where we explore Rome's desperate new strategy and the rise of the man who would be known as the Delayer. See you next time. The year is 217 BC, the dust of Trasimene has barely settled, and a cloud of fear hangs heavy over Rome. 2 consular armies, legions of Rome's finest, have been annihilated in swift succession. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian nightmare, is no longer a distant threat in the Alps. He is a specter haunting the very heartland of Italy. The road to Rome lies open, and its people, once brimming with confidence, now look to the skies, praying the gods haven't abandoned them. Panic grips the city. The Senate, the once inflappable bastion of the Republic, is in turmoil. The strategies of Scipio and Sempronius have failed spectacularly. Their aggression meeting only disaster. A radical new approach is needed. A leader who can think beyond the glorious, decisive battles that defined Roman warfare. In this moment of crisis, the Republic turns to an old, weathered statesman, a man whose cautious nature was often seen as a weakness, Quintus Fabius Maximus. In an extraordinary move, the Roman people bypass the usual electoral process and appoint him dictator, granting him supreme authority for 6 months. This isn't a position given lightly. It's a measure reserved for the gravest of emergencies. Fabius is not a dashing young hero. He is deliberate, patient, and, above all, a pragmatist. He looks at the situation not with the hot-blooded pride of a warrior, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a survivor. He understands a truth that his predecessors tragically missed. Hannibal is a military genius, perhaps the greatest the world has ever seen. To To face him in a pitched battle, on Hannibal's terms, is suicide. Rome's strength, Fabius realizes, is not in its generals, but in its resilience, its vast manpower, and its control of the Italian peninsula. Hannibal has a superior army, but he is an invader in a foreign land, cut off from easy resupply. His army is a finite resource. Rome's is not, and so the Fabian strategy is born. It is a strategy that goes against every instinct of Roman military tradition. It is a strategy of delay, of attrition, of calculated inaction. The Romans call him conctata, the delay. At first, it's a term of mockery. Fabius takes his newly raised legions and does the unthinkable. He refuses to fight. As Hannibal marches through the fertile plains of Campania, plundering and burning, Fabius shadows him. From the safety of the hills, the Roman army watches the smoke rise from villas and farms. They watch as Hannibal's men feast on the spoils of their land. The soldiers, itching for a fight, grow restless. The officers, men of noble birth raised on tales of glorious charges, grumble. Back in Rome, the political elite are furious. Is this Roman leadership? To hide in the hills while the enemy runs rampant, they demand action, a battle to restore Roman honor. But Fabius holds firm. He will not be baited. Every day Hannibal remains in Italy. His army consumes supplies. Every day he cannot force a decisive battle. His strategic advantage wanes. Fabius is playing a different game, not for a single victory, but for the survival of Rome itself. The tension comes to a head in a place called Agor. Hannibal, laden with loot, finds his path of retreat blocked. Fabius has him trapped, controlling the mountain pass. It seems the delayer is about to spring his trap. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for. But Hannibal, the master of improvisation, has a trick up his sleeve. Under the cover of night, he gathers 2,000 oxen, ties bundles of dry wood to their horns, and sets them alight. He then drives the terrified, flaming beasts up the hillside opposite the pass held by the Romans. The Roman sentries, seeing a massive force of torch-bearing soldiers moving through the night, panic. Thinking they are being outflanked, they abandon their posts to engage this phantom army. While they are distracted, Hannibal's main force marches silently through the noon-guarded pass, escaping the trap with all their plunder. The next morning, the humiliation is complete. Fabius has been out. The Concteras, caution, has been made to look like incompetence. This escape is a political disaster for Fabius. His master of the horse, Minucius Rufus, a man who has been his loudest critic, becomes the voice of the opposition. He openly claims that Fabius's cowardice allowed Hannibal to slip away. The Senate, owing to popular pressure, takes an unprecedented step. They elevate Minucius to have equal dictatorial power with Fabius. The Roman army is literally split in two. Minucius, finally unleashed, immediately seeks the glorious battle he craves. He leads his half of the army down from the hills and engages Hannibal's foragers. He achieves a minor success and, emboldened, prepares for a larger engagement. Hannibal, seeing this rashness, sets a trap. He conceals his best troops in the broken ground near the Roman camp and sends out a small force to act as bait. Minucius, arrogant and eager, takes the bait and charges with his entire force. The trap is sprung. The Carthaginians swarm out from their hiding places, and Minucius's legions are surrounded, on the verge of annihilation. It would have been another Trasimene, another Cannae before Cannae. But from the hills, Fabius has been watching. He had warned Minucius, but his duty was not to say, "I told you so." His duty was to Rome. Without hesitation, he orders his legions forward. "We must march," he declares, "not to save our misguided countrymen, but to save the Roman state." Minucius has been defeated by Hannibal, but he must not be destroyed. The appearance of Fabius's fresh army stuns the Hannibal, not willing to risk a larger battle against a fresh, well-ordered force, sounds the retreat. He has won the engagement, but Fabius has saved the Roman army from destruction. That evening, a humbled Minucius marches his men to Fabius's camp. He resigns his co-dictatorship and places himself and his legions back under Fabius's sole command. In front of the assembled army, he salutes Fabius, not as his colleague, but as his father and his savior. The soldiers of both camps, who had been on the brink of civil strife, cheer as one. In that moment, the Fabian strategy is vindicated. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was wise. It saved the army, and in doing so, it saved Rome. However, Fabius's 6-month term as dictator comes to an end. Despite his ultimate success, the political tide in Rome has turned decisively against him. The Roman people and their leaders are tired of delaying. They are tired of watching their lands be ravaged. They crave a return to the old ways, to a decisive, crushing victory that will expel Hannibal from Italy. Once and for all, they have forgotten the lessons of Trebia and Trasimene, and now, Abente. Near disaster. Avente. They dismiss the Cunctator, believing his time is past. New consuls are elected, Varro and Paulus, men who promise a new, aggressive approach. They will assemble the largest army Rome has ever put into the field and march south to confront Hannibal directly. The stage is being set for a final, epic confrontation. The wisdom of Fabius is cast aside in favor of popular demand for a glorious battle. A battle that will take place near a small village in Apulia, a place called Cannae. The greatest military disaster in Rome's history is now just over the horizon. The Fabian strategy had given Rome a chance to breathe, to regroup, to survive. But Rome, in its pride and impatience, would throw that chance away. The story of Fabius Maximus is a timeless lesson in leadership. It shows that true strength sometimes lies not in aggression, but in patience, not in seeking glory, but in accepting temporary humiliation for a greater, long-term goal. He understood his enemy and, more importantly, he understood his own side's strengths and weaknesses. He was willing to be unpopular, to be mocked, to risk his own reputation, all for the sake of his city's survival. While his strategy was temporarily abandoned, the shield of Rome, as he was later called, had bought the Republic precious time and taught it a lesson in resilience that would ultimately prove crucial to its eventual victory. But that victory was still a long way off, and before it, Rome would have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you're enjoying this series, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us create more content like this for you. We'll see you next time as we march towards the fateful fields of Cannae. Welcome back to our series on the Punic Wars. Today, we stand on the precipice of one of the most legendary, most studied, and most devastating battles in all of military history. The Battle of Cannae. The year is 216 BCE, Rome, the bruised but defiant superpower, is tired of being humiliated on its own soil by the Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca. After the stinging defeats at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, the Roman Senate decides to abandon the cautious tactics of Fabius the Delay. They resolve to crush Hannibal once and for all by fielding an army of unprecedented size. The plan was simple: overwhelm the invaders with sheer numbers. The Romans assembled a colossal force, possibly as many as 86,000 men, the largest army the Republic had ever put into the field. At its head were 2 consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro was aggressive and eager for a decisive battle, while Paulus was more cautious, wary of Hannibal's tactical brilliance. This division in command would prove to be a fatal flaw. In contrast, Hannibal's army was smaller, a mix of veteran Carthaginians, Spanish infantry, and Gallic warriors, totaling around 50,000. He was outnumbered, deep in enemy territory, and his supply lines were stretched thin. To any other general, the situation would have seemed hopeless, but for Hannibal, it was an opportunity. The 2 armies converged near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, on a wide, flat plain cut by the Aufidus River. This terrain was exactly what Hannibal wanted. It was perfect for his superior cavalry. As the sun rose on that fateful August day, the Roman legions began to form up. Varro, who was in command, made a critical decision. Instead of deploying his legions in their usual checkerboard formation, which maximized flexibility, he packed them into a deep, narrow column. His goal was to use this massive human battering ram to punch straight through the Carthaginian center and shatter their line. It was a strategy based on brute force, underestimating the mind of the man he was facing. Hannibal, observing the Roman deployment, smiled. He knew exactly what Varro was thinking, and he had prepared the perfect trap. He arranged his own forces in a highly unconventional formation. In the center, he placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and the Spanish infantry. He pushed them forward, forming a crescent that bulged out towards the Roman line. On the flanks, he positioned his elite African infantry, held back in columns, and on the far wings, he placed his devastating cavalry. The Numidians on one side and the Spanish and Gallic heavy horse on the other, commanded by his brother Mago and the brilliant cavalry leader Hasdrubal. The stage was set. Hannibal had essentially presented the Romans with a weak, inviting center, baiting them into the heart of his army. The battle began. The massive Roman column surged forward with a deafening roar, crashing into Hannibal's crescent-shaped center. As the Romans pushed, the Gauls and Spanish infantry did exactly what Hannibal had ordered them to do. They slowly gave ground, fighting a disciplined retreat. The crescent began to invert, bending inwards under the immense pressure of the legions. The Roman soldiers, sensing victory, roared with approval and pushed deeper and deeper into what they thought was a collapsing enemy line. They were so focused on the center, so convinced of their breakthrough, that they failed to notice what was happening on the flanks. While the Roman infantry was being drawn into the trap, Hannibal's cavalry had already won the battle on the wings. His heavy cavalry under Hasdrubal smashed into the weaker Roman horse, shattering them and sending them fleeing from the field. But instead of pursuing them, Hasdrubal executed a brilliant maneuver. He wheeled his entire force around the rear of the Roman army and attacked the remaining Roman cavalry on the other flank, which was engaged with the Numidians. With this two-sided attack, the rest of Rome's cavalry was destroyed. The Roman legions were now completely stripped of their cavalry support, their flanks dangerously exposed. Now, the trap slammed shut. As the Roman infantry pushed into the deepest point of the Carthaginian pocket, Hannibal gave the signal. His elite African infantry, who had been held in reserve on the flanks, turned inward and crashed into the exposed sides of the dense Roman column. The Romans, packed shoulder to shoulder, could barely lift their arms to fight back. Suddenly, they were being attacked, not just from the front, but from the left and the right as well. Their forward momentum ground to a halt. Then came the final, terrifying blow. Hasdrubal's victorious cavalry, having finished their work, completed their circle and slammed into the rear of the Roman legions. The encirclement was complete. The largest army Rome had ever fielded was now trapped in a ring of Carthaginian steel, a cauldron of death from which there was no escape. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Roman soldiers, unable to maneuver or even form a proper defense, were cut down by the thousands. The fields of Cannae ran red. The historian Livy describes a scene of pure horror, where men were so tightly packed they were simply suffocated or trampled to death. By the end of the day, the Roman army had ceased to exist. The scale of the defeat was catastrophic. Sources estimate that between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans were killed, including the consul Aemilius Paulus, 80 senators, and a huge portion of Rome's military and political elite. It was one of the single bloodiest days in military history. Hannibal had lost only around 6,000 men. He had achieved the perfect battle of annihilation, a tactical masterpiece that would be studied by generals for millennia to come. In the aftermath, his commanders urged him to march on Rome itself. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," one famously said, "but you do not know how to use it." But Hannibal didn't march on Rome. Why he hesitated is one of history's great debates. Perhaps his army was too exhausted, or he lacked the siege equipment to take the city. Whatever the reason, that moment passed, and though Rome was on its knees, reeling from a blow that would have destroyed any other nation, it did not break. The Battle of Cannae was Hannibal's greatest victory, but it would also be the high water mark of his invasion. The war was far from over, and Rome's ultimate response would be one of iron will and relentless determination. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Battle of Cannae. It's a truly epic and sobering moment in history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore how Rome recovered from this disaster. Imagine this. You've just suffered the single worst military defeat in your entire history. Not one, but two massive armies annihilated. Your best generals are dead, your allies are defecting, and the enemy, a military genius named Hannibal, is now marching through your heartland, seemingly unstoppable. This was the grim reality for the Roman Republic after the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. By all conventional logic, Rome should have collapsed. Any other nation, ancient or modern, likely would have sued for peace, accepted defeat, and faded into the annals of history as just another failed state. But Rome was different. This is the story of what happened next. It's a story not of brilliant victories on the battlefield, but of something far more profound. The story of how a nation refused to fall. It's the story of Roman resilience. In the immediate aftermath of Cannae, chaos and despair gripped the city. The historian Livy tells us that the wails of grieving families echoed through the streets. The Senate, the very heart of the Republic, was in shock. Nearly a third of its members had been killed in the recent disasters. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned them. But in this darkest of hours, something incredible happened. The Romans did not surrender. They didn't even consider it. The very word peace was forbidden in the Forum. Instead of capitulating, they got to work. This is where we see the true genius of the Roman system. It wasn't just about legions and swords. It was about an unshakable civic spirit and an astonishing capacity for adaptation. The first order of business was to restore order and, crucially, morale. The man who stepped up was Quintus Fabius Maximus, a seasoned statesman who had been warning against a direct confrontation with Hannibal all along. His strategy, which we now call Fabian tactics, was simple yet revolutionary. Avoid Hannibal's main army at all costs. Don't give him the decisive battle he craves. Instead, shadow him, harass his foraging parties, cut off his supply lines, and slowly, methodically, wear him down. This was a bitter pill for the proud Romans to swallow. It felt cowardly, but Fabius understood a crucial truth. You can't win a game you're destined to lose. You have to change the rules. While Fabius kept Hannibal occupied and contained in southern Italy, the Senate embarked on an unprecedented national mobilization. They lowered the property qualifications for military service, and then they lowered them again. Soon, they were enlisting landless citizens, something that had been unthinkable just a few years prior. When that wasn't enough, they took an even more radical step. They armed 8,000 slaves, promising them freedom in exchange for their service. Think about the social implications of that decision. In a society built on slave labor, they were willing to append their own social order for the sake of survival. They even emptied the armories and temples of old, captured weapons to equip these new legions. Every sinew of the state was strained towards a single goal, raising new armies. But where would the money come from? The treasury was empty. The state was essentially bankrupt. So, the senators led by example. They brought their personal wealth, their gold, their silver, their bronze, and donated it all to the state treasury. The equestrian class, the wealthy businessmen, follow Ed Suite. It was a massive, voluntary contribution from the elite, a public declaration that they were all in this together. This act did more than just fill the coffers. It galvanized the populace. It showed that the Republic wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a shared enterprise worth sacrificing for. While this was happening in Italy, Rome opened new fronts. They knew they couldn't just play defense. They sent armies to Spain to cut off Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, preventing him from bringing reinforcements and supplies. They sent forces to Sicily and Macedonia to deal with allies who had defected to Hannibal's side. It was a global war, and Rome fought it on all fronts simultaneously, even while the main enemy army was camped on their doorstep. This required immense logistical coordination and a seemingly endless supply of manpower, which Rome, through its system of alliances and citizenship grants across Italy, was uniquely able to provide. Many of their Italian allies remained loyal, seeing that Rome, even in its weakened state, was still the best bet for long-term security and stability. Over the next decade, the war became a brutal grind. Hannibal marched up and down the Italian peninsula, winning smaller battles, but never able to break the Roman system. He couldn't besiege Rome itself, because he lacked the necessary siege equipment and supply lines, which Fabius's tactics constantly disrupted. He was a conqueror, trapped in the country he had conquered. He had hoped that Rome's allies would flock to his banner, but the core of the Roman Confederation held firm. For every city that defected, 2 more remained loyal, their faith in Roman tenacity unshaken. And as the years passed, a new generation of Roman commanders emerged. Commanders who had learned from the defeats of their fathers. They studied Hannibal's tactics, they adapted, and they became more cautious, more professional. The most famous of these, of course, was Publius Cornelius. He had witnessed the horror of Cannae as a young officer and survived. Instead of being broken by it, he was forged by it. In Spain, he practiced and perfected new tactics, combining Roman discipline with the kind of tactical flexibility he had learned from Hannibal. This period of Roman history is so crucial because it demonstrates that resilience is indeed just about stubbornly enduring hardship. It's about active adaptation. It's about reforming institutions, changing strategies, and innovating under the most extreme pressure. Rome didn't just survive Hannibal, it was fundamentally changed by him. The army became more professional. The state's financial and logistical systems became more sophisticated. The Roman identity, its sense of exceptionalism and destiny, was hardened into an unbreakable creed. When they faced catastrophic losses, they didn't look for a scapegoat. They looked for solutions. They didn't panic. They organized. They didn't surrender. They doubled down. Eventually, Scipio would take the fight to Africa, Hannibal's home turf, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general to defend the city. And at the Battle of Zama, Scipio, using tactics learned from the master himself, would finally defeat Hannibal, ending the long nightmare. But the victory at Zama was only possible because of the decade of sacrifice, reform, and sheer, bloody-minded refusal to quit that came after Cannae. Rome's greatest victory wasn't won on a single battlefield. It was won in the halls of the Senate, in the farms and workshops of Italy, and in the hearts of a people who, when faced with annihilation, simply refused to fall. That is the ultimate testament to Roman resilience, a lesson in national fortitude that echoes through the ages. Thank you so much for watching. This part of Roman history is a personal favorite of mine, as it speaks volumes about the character of the Republic. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the ancient world. Let me know in the comments what aspect of Roman resilience impresses you the most. Until next time. After the monumental victory at Cannae, Hannibal stood at the precipice of glory. All of Italy seemed ready to fall into his hands. He was the undisputed master of the battlefield, a military genius who had humbled the mighty Roman Republic. But what happens when the lightning strike doesn't end the storm? What happens when the conqueror is forced to wait? This is the story of Hannibal's long, frustrating decade in Italy, a tale not of grand battles, but of a slow grinding war of attrition that would test the very limits of his genius and his will. For over 10 years, Hannibal and his army became a specter haunting the Italian peninsula. They were a constant, menacing presence, a wound that Rome could not heal. But critically, Hannibal lacked the one thing he needed most: a CHA train. The heavy equipment, the engineers, the sheer manpower required to breach the walls of Rome itself were all missing. He had hoped that his stunning victories would cause a cascade of that Rome's allies would flock to his banner, providing him with the resources to finish the job. He was a master of the open field, but the stone walls of Rome were a different kind of enemy. So, he consolidated his position in southern Italy, forging alliances with cities like Capua, the second largest city in Italy. This was a major political victory. He hoped it would be the first of many dominoes to fall. The plan was simple: peel away Rome's allies, isolate the city, and starve it into submission. For a time, it seemed to be working. The south of Italy was largely in his camp. He was the de facto ruler of a significant portion of the peninsula. He spent his time training his troops, managing his new allies, and sending desperate pleas back to Carthage for reinforcements and supplies. He had proven he could defeat Roman armies. Now he needed the backing of his own government to lay siege to the heart of his enemy. But Rome wasn't idle. They had learned a brutal lesson. They would no longer face Hannibal in open battle. A new strategy emerged, championed by a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus, who would earn the nickname Conteta, the Delayer. The Fabian strategy was simple, yet brilliant in its own frustrating way. Shadow Hannibal, harass his foraging parties, attack his allies, but never, ever engage his main army in a pitched battle. It was a war of mosquitoes against a lion. Rome would bleed him slowly, denying him the glorious, decisive victory he craved. For a man like Hannibal, a warrior who lived for the clash of steel, this was a special kind of torture. Imagine the scene. Hannibal marches his army through the Italian countryside, looking for a Roman force to crush. But everywhere he goes, the Romans melt away. They burn the fields ahead of him, forcing his army to march further and further for food. They pick off his scouts. They lay siege to the cities that had allied with him, forcing Hannibal to constantly rush from one place to another to protect his friends. He was playing a giant, countrywide game of whack-a-mole, and the Romans held the mallet. He was winning every skirmish, but losing the strategic war. His army, a magnificent instrument of war, was slowly being worn down by time, hunger, and the endless, nagging attacks of an enemy that refused to fight. Meanwhile, his Italian allies were growing nervous. They had joined Hannibal expecting a quick victory, a swift overthrow of Roman dominance. Instead, they found their lands becoming the primary battleground. Roman legions, avoiding Hannibal himself, were systematically punishing any city that had dared to side with the Carthaginian. Capua, which had once welcomed Hannibal as a liberator, was besieged by the Romans. Hannibal tried to break the siege, but the Romans had built formidable defenses. In a desperate gamble, he even marched on Rome itself, hoping to draw the besieging army away from Capua. He camped within sight of the city walls, a terrifying gesture, but it was a bluff. The Romans knew he couldn't take the city, and they didn't flinch. The siege of Capua continued, and eventually, to city fell. The Romans made a brutal example of it, executing its leaders and selling its people into slavery. The message to Hannibal's other allies was clear and chilling. Rome's vengeance is patient, but it is absolute. And what of Carthage? Where was the support Hannibal so desperately needed? The political factions back home were squabbling. His rivals in the Carthaginian Senate argued that his war was too expensive, too risky. They saw his success not as a national triumph, but as a threat to their own power. Reinforcements were promised, but rarely arrived. Supplies trickled in when a flood was needed. Hannibal had a brother, Hasdrubal, who was fighting his own desperate war against the Romans in Spain, trying to open a second front and march to his aid. But the Romans, led by a brilliant young general named Scipio, were keeping him pinned down. Hannibal was effectively alone, an island of Carthaginian power in a sea of Roman hostility. Year after year passed. The veterans of Cannae grew old. New recruits, many of them local Italians, lacked the discipline and loyalty of his original army. The war had transformed from a daring invasion into a grim struggle for survival. Hannibal was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, trapped in a cage of his own making. He had shattered army after army, but he could not shatter the will of the Roman people. Their system of alliances, their vast reserves of manpower, and their unyielding refusal to admit defeat were proving to be more resilient than any fortress wall. This period, often overlooked between the dramatic battles of Trasimene and Zama, is perhaps the most telling of all. It reveals the true nature of the Second Punic War. It wasn't just a contest between two great generals, but a clash between two fundamentally different systems. Carthage, a maritime trading empire, relied on a brilliant individual to win a war. Rome, a land-based republic, relied on its institutions, its society, and its collective determination. In the long, grueling years of the Fabian strategy, Rome's system proved stronger. Hannibal could win battles, but Rome could win the war. The greatest military commander of his age had been fought to a standstill, not by a better army, but by a better strategy and a more resolute state. The stage was now being set for the final, dramatic act of this epic conflict, one that would not take place in Italy, but on the shores of Africa itself. Thank you so much for watching. This chapter in Hannibal's story is a powerful lesson in strategy and resilience. If you're finding this history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the ancient world. We'll see you in the next chapter. While Hannibal was busy turning Italy upside down, a storm was gathering on another front, a storm that would eventually change the course of the war. Let's shift our gaze to Spain, a land that had become a crucial chessboard for both Rome and Carthage. After the tragic deaths of the two Spio brothers, Publius and Neos, Roman fortunes in Spain were at their lowest. It seemed as if Carthage, under the command of Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, had finally secured the peninsula. Morale in Rome was plummeting. Who could possibly turn this disaster around? Who would dare to take on a command that had already claimed two of Rome's finest generals? The answer came from a place no one expected. The assembly was convened in Rome to elect a new commander for Spain. But silence filled the campus mart. No senator, no seasoned general, stepped forward. The Spanish command was seen as a death sentence. Then, a young man, just 25 years old, rose from the crowd and ascended the rostrum. He was the son of the fallen general Publius Scipio. His name was also Publius Cornelius Scipio. The crowd was stunned. He was too young, technically ineligible for the rank of but in his eyes, they saw the fire of his father and uncle, a burning desire for vengeance, and a confidence that belied his years. In a moment of unprecedented popular support, the people of Rome cast aside tradition and bestowed the Spanish command upon him. This wasn't just any young aristocrat. This was a man who, as a teenager, had reportedly saved his own father's life at the Battle of the Tessin. He was a survivor of the nightmare at Cannae, one of the few officers who managed to rally the broken remnants of the Roman army. He was charismatic, deeply religious, and possessed a military mind that was, dare I say, almost Hannibal-like in its creativity and audacity. He understood that to beat Hannibal, one couldn't just follow the old Roman playbook. You had to think like him, to be as unpredictable and daring as him. And so, in 210 BC, Scipio set sail for Spain, not just as a general, but as the embodiment of Rome's last, desperate hope. Upon arriving in Spain, Scipio found the Roman forces demoralized and penned up north of the Ebro River. The three Carthaginian armies, led by Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and another Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, were scattered across the peninsula, confident in their superiority. They didn't see the young Scipio as a serious threat. This was their first, and perhaps greatest, mistake. Scipio spent his first winter drilling his troops relentlessly, restoring their discipline and, more importantly, their belief in themselves. He visited his allies, the Spanish tribes, listening to their grievances and winning their trust, not with threats, but with promises of justice and respect. He was building more than an army. He was building a coalition. While the Carthaginian generals were wintering in their separate camps, miles apart from one another, Scipio was planning a mass. He learned through meticulous intelligence gathering that the main Carthaginian base, their treasury, their arsenal, and their Spanish hostages were all located in one place, the city of Carthago Nova, or New Carthage. Today, we call it Cartagena. The city was considered impregnable, protected by the sea on one side and the narrow isthmus on the other. The Carthaginian commanders felt it was so secure that they left it with only a token garrison. They never imagined anyone would be bold enough to attack it directly. In the spring of 209 BC, Scipio did the unthinkable. Leaving a small force to guard the Ebro, he took the bulk of his army, about 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry, and made a lightning-fast march south. He covered over 300 miles in a week, a feat of logistics and speed that was pure Hannibal. He arrived before the walls of New Carthage, taking the garrison completely by surprise. The three Carthaginian armies were too far away to intervene. Scipio had isolated his target. The Roman soldiers were stunned. They had marched for days, only to be confronted by what seemed like an impossible objective. But Scipio had a secret. He had learned from local fishermen that the lagoon protecting one side of the city was shallow, and that at low tide, it was possible to wade across it. This was his key. while he launched a furious diversionary assault on the main gate across the isthmus. Drawing the defenders' attention, he had a hand-picked force of 500 men wait for the tide to turn. As the main battle raged, the water level in the lagoon dropped. The 500 soldiers, carrying ladders, waded through the shallow water and found the northern wall completely unguarded. They scaled the walls, let out a mighty shout, and charged down into the city, attacking the defenders of the main gate from behind. Panic erupted. The gate was thrown open, and the main Roman army flooded into New Carthage. The city fell in a matter of hours. The capture of New Carthage was more than just a military victory. It was a strategic and psychological earthquake. In one brilliant stroke, Scipio seized the entire Carthaginian war chest, vast supplies of grain, weapons, and siege equipment. He captured their fleet and, most importantly, the Spanish hostages. And here, Scipio showed his true genius, which went beyond the battlefield. Instead of treating the hostages as prisoners, he treated them with incredible kindness and respect. He reassured the noble families that their sons and daughters were safe. He famously refused to even look at a beautiful captive woman brought to him, instead returning her to refuge. A powerful Celtiberian chieftain, along with the ransom her parents had offered. This act of magnanimity, of calculated clemency, reverberated throughout Spain. It was a stark contrast to the often arrogant and exploitative behavior of the Carthaginian commanders. Spanish tribes began to see Scipio not as another foreign conqueror, but as a liberator. Chieftains flocked to his banner, pledging their warriors to his cause. His fiancée, the one whose bride Scipio had returned, arrived in his camp a few weeks later with thousands of his best fighters. Scipio's army swelled in size, but more importantly, he had begun to win the hearts and minds of the Spanish people, denying Carthage its most crucial base of manpower and support. The Carthaginian generals were caught completely flat-footed. Hannibal Barca, Hannibal's brother, now had to face Scipio. He couldn't afford to let the young Roman consolidate his gains. The following year, 208 veces, the two armies met at Becula in southern Spain. Scipio, though outnumbered, again used innovative tactics. He used his light troops to pin the Carthaginian center on a high plateau, while his main legions executed a brilliant double-flank attack, enveloping and crushing the Carthaginian wings. It was another stunning victory. Hasdrubal managed to escape with the core of his army, but his position in Spain was becoming untenable. He made a fateful decision. Rather than stay and fight a losing war against Scipio, he would follow his brother's footsteps. He would gather his remaining forces and march for Italy, hoping to link up with Hannibal and deliver the final blow to Rome. Scipio has been criticized by some historians for letting Hasdrubal escape Spain, but Scipio's strategic calculation was sound. His primary mission was to secure Spain, not to chase every enemy army across the map. Chasing Hasdrubal into the rugged interior would have been risky and could have exposed his own base at New Carthage. Instead, Scipio focused on systematically dismantling the remaining Carthaginian power in the peninsula. He knew that another Roman army was waiting in Italy to deal with Hasdrubal. His job was here. Over the next 2 years, Scipio methodically defeated the remaining Carthaginian forces. The final, decisive battle took place in 206 BC at Alipa. This was Scipio's tactical masterpiece, a battle that military historians still study today. Facing a larger army under Hannibal Barca and Hasdrubal Gisco, Scipio used a reverse Cannae formation. He placed his less reliable Spanish allies in the center and his veteran Roman legions on the wings. But on the day of the battle, he had his troops eat before dawn and then marched out early. He then spent hours maneuvering in front of the enemy line, forcing the Carthaginians, who had not yet eaten, to stand under the hot Spanish sun. When the battle finally began, Scipio advanced his wings rapidly while holding his center back. The powerful Roman legions on the flanks crashed into and destroyed the weaker African levies on the Carthaginian wings. Then, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, Scipio's legions wheeled inwards, enveloping the elite Carthaginian center from both sides. It was a complete and utter annihilation. The Carthaginian army was shattered beyond recovery. After Alipa, Carthaginian rule in Spain was effectively over. Hannibal Barca fled to the Balearic Islands with a few survivors, and the city of Gates, the last Punic stronghold, surrendered to Rome. In just 4 years, A man who arrived as a 25-year-old upstart had conquered the entire Iberian Peninsula for the Roman Republic, with Spain secure. Scipio's gaze turned towards the man whose shadow had loomed over his entire life. Hannibal. Scipio returned to Rome in 205 BC, not just as a hero, but as the only general who had consistently and decisively beaten Carthaginian armies. He was elected consul. Despite still being technically too young, he proposed a radical, audacious plan. Take the war to Africa, invade Carthage's homeland, just as Hannibal had invaded Italy's. The older, more cautious senators, led by the venerable Fabius Maximus, were horrified. It was too risky, they argued. Hannibal was still in Italy, but Scipio, with the overwhelming support of the people, won the debate. He was given the command and permission to raise a new army. The stage was now set for the final act of this epic drama. The shadow of Scipio, which first rose over the battlefields of Spain, was now poised to fall upon Africa itself. Two of the greatest military minds in all of history, Hannibal Barca and Publius Cornelius Scipio, were on a collision course. One was the aging titan who had terrorized Rome for a decade and a half. The other was the young prodigy who had studied his enemies' methods, mastered them, and even improved upon them. Their names would be forever linked by the battle that was to come, a battle that would not only decide the fate of Rome and Carthage, but would shape the future of the entire Western world. The showdown at Zama was approaching. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the rise of Scipio. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter, where everything comes to a head. For 15 years, Hannibal Barca had waged a relentless war against Rome, entirely on Italian soil. He had crossed the Alps, shattered legions at Trebia, Trasimene, and most famously, at Cannae. He was the boogeyman Roman mothers used to frighten their children, the specter that haunted the Senate's every waking moment. He had brought the world's greatest power to its knees, yet he had never managed to deliver the final, killing blow. Rome, stubborn and resilient, refused to break. Now, the tables were turning. While Hannibal was pinned down in southern Italy, his grand strategy slowly unraveling, a new Roman star was on the rise. Publius Cornelius. He was young, brilliant, and had learned from Hannibal's own playbook. After conquering Carthaginian holdings in Spain, Scipio proposed a daring, almost unthinkable plan to the Roman Senate. Take the war to Carthage itself, invade Africa. It was a strategy born of desperation and genius. The Roman establishment, led by the old guard like Fabius Maximus, was horrified. To them, leaving Hannibal loose in Italy to invade a foreign continent was madness. They argued it was too risky, that Rome's defenses would be left vulnerable. But Scipio's charisma, his string of victories in Spain, and the sheer audacity of his plan won over the people and, eventually, a reluctant Senate. They gave him the command, but with limited resources, almost daring him to fail. Scipio, however, was not a man to be underestimated. He landed in North Africa in 204 BC and began a campaign that mirrored Hannibal's in Italy. He forged alliances with local Numidian princes, most notably Massinissa, a powerful cavalry leader who held a grudge against Carthage. Scipio's forces began to systematically dismantle Carthaginian power in their own backyard. They won key battles, burned enemy camps, and laid siege to vital cities. The panic in Carthage was palpable. The enemy they had fought for so long on distant shores was now at their very gates. The Carthaginian Council, the same body that had so often failed to properly reinforce Hannibal in Italy, was now in a state of utter desperation. Their own armies were proving no match for Scipio's disciplined legions and Massinissa's superb cavalry. Every dispatch from the front brought more bad news. They saw only one hope, one legendary figure who might yet save them from annihilation. They sent a message across the Mediterranean, a message that would change the course of the war and seal the fate of their greatest general. The message was simple. Come home. Hannibal is needed. For Hannibal, the summons must have been a moment of profound bitterness and irony. He had spent his entire adult life, his entire being, dedicated to the war in Italy. He had sacrificed everything, bled for every inch of ground, and begged for the reinforcements that never came. Now, he was being ordered to abandon his life's work, to leave the land he had conquered and terrorized for a decade and a half. He was being recalled not in triumph, but in desperation, to save the very city that had so often neglected him. Polybius, the great historian, tells us that Hannibal gnashed his teeth and barely refrained from tears upon receiving the order. He accused the Carthaginian government of not pulling him back out of genuine concern, but out of jealousy. Just as he was about to finally take Rome, he saw his grand strategy, his life's ambition, crumbling to dust. He had brought Rome to the brink, but now he had to leave the final act on. The departure from Italy was a somber affair. He gathered his remaining veterans, the hard-bitten men who had followed him from Spain, across the Alps, and through countless bloody battles. These were the survivors of the Grand Army, men who knew no other life than war under their brilliant commander. He had to abandon his Italianales, leaving them to the mercy of a vengeful Rome. It was a retreat, the first true retreat of his career. As his ships pulled away from the Italian coast, it said that Hannibal looked back one last time at the land he had failed to conquer, his heart filled with regret for the chances lost and the prize that had slipped through his fingers. Upon landing in Africa, after an absence of 36 years, Hannibal found a situation far more dire than he could have imagined. He was a stranger in his own land. The army he was given was a shadow of his veteran force in Italia, hastily assembled mix of rusted foreign mercenaries, and the battered remnants of the army Scipio had already defeated. His legendary cavalry advantage was gone. In fact, the best Numidian horsemen, under Mas, were now fighting for Rome. Despite these overwhelming disadvantages, Hannibal, the master tactician, immediately began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. He set up his camp, drilled his inexperienced troops, and tried to mold them into a cohesive fighting force. He knew he was facing a commander of a different caliber than the ones he had so easily dispatched in Italy. Scipio was his intellectual equal, a student of his own methods, and he now held all the advantages. Before the final, cataclysmic battle, the two greatest generals of the age met face. It was a moment for the ages. They met in the space between their armies, accompanied by only a few interpreters. Hannibal, the older, more experienced warrior, spoke first. He spoke of the fortunes of war, how victory can turn to defeat in an instant. He praised Scipio's successes and proposed a peace treaty. Carthage would surrender all its overseas territories. Sicily, Sardinia, and never again challenge Rome's dominance. It was a concession of defeat, an attempt to save his city from utter destruction. Scipio's reply was firm and uncompromising. He reminded Hannibal that Rome had offered generous terms before, but Carthage had broken the truce. Now, after Hannibal's return, and with a Roman army poised for victory on African soil, the time for negotiation was over. The gods themselves, he declared, were pushing them towards battle. The fate of their empires would not be decided by words, but by the sword. The meeting ended. There would be no peace. The stage was set for the Battle of Zama. Hannibal returned to his camp, knowing he was about to fight the most difficult battle of his life. He was on his home soil, fighting not for conquest, but for survival. The man who had been the hunter for so long was now the hunter. His long war, which began with a triumphant march through Europe, was to end here, in the dust of Africa, facing a Roman army that had learned, adapted, and was now ready to deliver the final blow. The recall to Africa had brought the war full circle, leading to one climactic duel that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter of our series on the Punic Wars. It's an incredible story of strategy, rivalry, and the turning tides of history. If you're enjoying this journey, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the epic conclusion. We'll see you next time for the Battle of Zama. The year is 202 BCE. The stage is set on the dusty plains of Zama in modern Tunisia. This isn't just another battle. This is the final, decisive clash of the Second Punic War, a conflict that has raged across the Mediterranean for nearly 2 decades. Two of history's greatest military minds, Hannibal Barca of Carthage and Scipio Africanus of Rome, are about to face each other for the first and only time. The fate of empires hangs in the balance. For 16 long years, Hannibal had terrorized Italy. He had crossed the Alps with elephants, annihilated Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously, at Cannae. He was the bogeyman Roman mothers used to scare their children, a seemingly invincible force that had brought the mighty republic to its knees. But he had never taken Rome itself. Now, the war had come home. Scipio, a brilliant young Roman general who had studied Hannibal's tactics and honed his skills in Spain, had done the unthinkable. He had invaded Africa, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest champion. Imagine the tension on that morning. On one side, Hannibal, the seasoned veteran, commanding a mixed army of his loyal Italian veterans, raw Carthaginian levies, and a terrifying vanguard of 80 war elephants. He knew his forces were a patchwork, his cavalry inferior. His strategy relied on one thing: creating chaos with his elephant charge and breaking the Roman lines before their superior horsemen could turn the tide. He was gambling everything on a single, decisive punch. On the other side stood Scipio. He was younger, but his army was a well-oiled machine, composed of disciplined Roman legionaries and, crucially, a powerful cavalry force led by the Numidian king Massinissa, a former ally of Carthage who had switched sides. Scipio had a plan, a brilliant and audacious counter to Hannibal's Elephantera. He had studied his enemy, understood his strengths, and devised a way to turn them into weaknesses. He wasn't just there to fight. He was there to outthink the master tactician. Before the battle, the two generals met face to face between their armies. It was a moment for the ages. Hannibal, the aging warrior, allegedly offered peace terms, acknowledging the fortunes of war. Scipio, confident and representing a Rome bent on total victory, refused. There would be no negotiation. The dispute would be settled by the sword. The die was cast. As the trumpets blared, Hannibal unleashed his elephants. This was meant to be the decisive moment, the shock and awe that would shatter the Roman formation. But Scipio was ready. He had arranged his menopulsta rectangular units of the legionate in the usual checkerboard pattern, but in straight columns. This created wide lanes running through his entire army. Instead of crashing into a solid wall of shields and spears, the charging elephants were funneled down these corridors. Harassed by Roman skirmishers and terrified by the blare of Roman horns, many of the beasts ran harmlessly through the gaps to the rear of the army. Others, panicked and wounded, turned back and stampeded into Hannibal's own lines, sowing the very chaos they were meant to create. The first gambit had failed. Catastrophically, with the elephant threat neutralized, the real battle began. The infantry lines crashed together. Hannibal's veterans in the front fought with the ferocity and skill you'd expect, pushing the Roman Hasidae back. But Scipio's legions were disciplined. They held their ground, a grinding, bloody stalemate in the center. This was a meat grinder, a test of pure will and endurance. But the decisive action was happening on the flanks. Scipio's superior Roman and Numidian cavalry, led by Lalius and Massinissa, quickly overwhelmed and scattered the weaker Carthaginian horsemen. Instead of pursuing them off the battlefield, as was so common in ancient warfare, they showed incredible discipline. They rallied and performed a classic, sweeping maneuver, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae. They were about to slam into the rear of the Carthaginian infantry. Hannibal saw it coming. He tried to adjust his lines, to form a defensive front, to protect his rear, but it was too late. His army was now engaged on two fronts. The Roman legions pressed from the front, while the thunder of hooves announced the arrival of Scipio's cavalry from behind. The Carthaginian army was encircled, trapped. The result was a slaughter. Hannibal's forces were crushed between the hammer of the cavalry and the anvil of the infantry. The proud army that had followed him through Italy was annihilated. Carthage's military power was broken, once and for all. Hannibal himself managed to escape the carnage, a general defeated on the field for the first time in a major battle. The Battle of Zama was more than just a Roman victory. It was the end of an era. It marked the final submission of Carthage, which was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty, stripping it of its overseas territories, its navy, and its ability to wage war without Rome's permission. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean, setting it on the path to becoming the vast empire we remember today. For Hannibal, it was the end of his long war. He had come so close to breaking Rome, but at Zama, he was outmaneuvered by a student who had learned his own lessons all too well. The great Carthaginian general would spend the rest of his life as a hunted exile, forever the enemy of Rome. Zama was his final, tragic masterpiece of battle that sealed his fate and secured the future of his greatest rival. It was the day the student truly surpassed the master. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to one of history's most pivotal battles. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration of the past. Let us know in the comments what battle you'd like to see us cover next. Until then, stay curious. Have you ever wondered what happens to a great general after the war is lost? For Hannibal Barca, the man who brought Rome to its knees, the end of the Second Punic War wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new, perhaps even more tragic chapter. Defeated at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal returned to Carthage, not as a conquered hero, but as a leader ready to rebuild. His city was crippled, burdened by a crushing indemnity owed to Rome. The Carthaginian aristocracy, corrupt and self-serving, was more interested in lining their own pockets than in restoring their nation's strength. They had undermined him during the war, and now they were plundering what was left. But Hannibal was not just a general, he was a statesman. Seeing the decay from within, Hannibal decided to act. He ran for the office of a shafot, or chief magistrate, and won a landslide victory. The people still loved him. He immediately launched a series of sweeping reforms aimed at breaking the power of the corrupt oligarchy. He restructured the state finances, exposing the embezzlement that was rampant among the elite. He made the government more democratic, transferring power from the permanent, self-selecting council of aristocrats to a popularly elected body. For a brief moment, it seemed like a new dawn for Carthage. The city's economy boomed, so much so that they were able to offer to pay off their entire war debt to Rome in a lump sum, decades ahead of schedule. But this success came at a cost. Hannibal's reforms made him powerful enemies within Carthage. The old aristocrats, stripped of their power and illicit income, were furious. They saw only one way to get rid of Hannibal, by turning to his greatest enemy, Rome. They secretly sent envoys to the Roman Senate, whispering poison in their ears. They claimed Hannibal was plotting a new war, that he was secretly negotiating with foreign kings to build a new anti-Roman coalition. Now, you might think Rome, having won the war, would ignore these petty squabbles. But the name Hannibal still struck fear into the heart of every Roman. They had never forgotten the terror of Cannae or the years he spent rampaging through Italy. The Romans sent a commission to Carthage, ostensibly to mediate a minor dispute, but their real mission was to demand Hannibal's surrender. Hannibal knew immediately what this meant. His own countrymen had betrayed him. He could fight, plunging Carthage into a new, hopeless war with Rome, or he could flee. For the love of his city, exile. One night, under the cover of darkness, the greatest general of his age slipped out of the city he had fought so hard to protect and set sail into the Mediterranean, a hunted man. His first stop was Tyre, the ancient mother city of Carthage, in Moderunde, Lebanon. He was welcomed as a living legend, a hero of the Phoenician people. But he couldn't stay. Rome's shadow was long, and their agents were everywhere. Hannibal's journey took him eastward, to the court of Antiochus III, the king of the vast Seleucid Empire. Antiochus styled himself the Great and dreamed of challenging Rome's growing power in the eastern Mediterranean. To him, Hannibal was the ultimate prize, the one man who knew how to defeat the Romans. Hannibal offered his expertise, proposing a daring strategy. Give him a small fleet and an army, and he would sail back to Italy, igniting another war on Roman soil while Antiochus attacked him in Greece. It was a brilliant plan, a potential repeat of his greatest triumph. But Antiochus was a proud and suspicious king. He was in awe of Hannibal, but also deeply jealous of his fame and talent. The king's sycophantic advisors warned him not to trust the Carthaginian, planting seeds of doubt that Hannibal might be a Roman double agent or that he would steal the glory of any victory. Consequently, Antiochus sidelined Hannibal, giving him only a minor naval command. Without Hannibal's strategic genius guiding the main effort, Antiochus's war against Rome was a disaster. The Seleucid army was crushed, and one of the peace terms Rome imposed was simple and chilling. Surrender Hannibal Barca. Once again, Hannibal was forced to flee for his life, escaping just before the Roman envoys arrived to collect him. He was now a true fugitive, the most wanted man in the world. His wanderings continued. He found temporary refuge in Crete and then Armenia, always one step ahead of the relentless Roman pursuit. His name was a curse, bringing Roman attention and threats to anyone who dared to offer him shelter. Finally, his journey led him to the court of King Prusios of Bithynia, a small kingdom in what is now northwestern Turkey. Prusias, warring with a neighboring kingdom allied with Rome, was willing to use Hannibal's military skill. For a time, the old general was back in his element, leading Bithynian forces and winning a clever naval victory by, according to legend, launching pots filled with venomous snakes onto the enemy ships. But it couldn't last. Rome's spies eventually tracked him down. A Roman delegation, led by a senator named Flamininus, arrived in Bithynia. They didn't come to negotiate. They came with an ultimatum for King Prusias. "Give us Hannibal." Prusias, fearing the wrath of the Roman Republic, had no choice but to comply. He betrayed his guest, sending soldiers to surround the small villa where Hannibal was living. Hannibal, now in his mid-60s, saw that the house was surrounded. There was no escape. He had known this day would come. For years, he had carried a poison ring, determined never to be captured and paraded through the streets of Rome in a humiliating triumph. He looked at the soldiers closing in, the final act in a life defined by his struggle against Rome. His last words were a bitter condemnation of his enemies and the treacherous king who had sold him out. "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans," he is said to have declared, "who have thought it too long and too tedious to wait for the death of a hated old man." Then he drank the poison, and so died Hannibal Barca. Not on a battlefield at the head of an army, but alone, in exile, betrayed. A titan brought down not by the might of Roman legions, but by the relentless, patient, and unforgiving nature of Roman politics. His life was a testament to his genius, and his death was the final proof of Rome's undying fear of him. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Hannibal's final years. It's a powerful story of resilience, betrayal, and the cruel twists of fate. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. And let me know in the comments what you think about Hannibal's tragic end. See you next time. The year is 183 BC in the small Bithynian village of Labisa. An old man resides, his hair now silver, his steps slower, but his eyes still burning with a fire that once terrified the most powerful republic in the world. This is Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who brought Rome to its knees. For decades, even in exile, his name has been a specter haunting the Roman Senate, a constant source of anxiety and fear. They could never rest as long as Hannibal lived. After his defeat at Zama, Hannibal became a statesman, reforming Carthage and trying to rebuild its strength. But his success only made his enemies in Carthage and in Rome more nervous. Falsely accused of plotting with the Seleucid Empire against Rome, he was forced to flee his beloved city, becoming a wanderer, a man without a country. He sought refuge in the courts of eastern kings, from Antiochus, the Great in Syria, to King Prusios of Bithynia, always offering his unparalleled military genius, always with one goal in mind: to find a way, any way, to challenge Rome again. But Rome's reach was long, and its memory even longer. The Senate dispatched one of their best diplomats, Titus Quincus, Flamininus, the man who had defeated Philip V of Macedon. His mission wasn't just diplomacy, it was a manhunt. He arrived at the court of King Prusios with a simple, non-negotiable demand: hand over Hannibal. King Prusios, fearing the might of Rome more than he valued the loyalty to his guest, agreed. The king who had once welcomed the legendary general now betrayed him. Roman soldiers, acting on Prusias's information, surrounded Hannibal's villa in Labisa. Every exit was blocked. The old lion was finally cornered. When Hannibal's servants brought him the news, a grim understanding settled upon him. He had known this day might come. For years, he he had carried a small vial of poison, concealed within a ring, a final act of defiance against a world that had turned against him. Capture was not an option. He would never be paraded through the streets of Rome in a triumph, a symbol of their final victory over Carthage. His pride, his very essence, would not allow it. Looking at the vial in his hand, he thought of his life's journey. From the oath he swore to his father as a boy, to never be a friend of Rome, to the frozen peaks of the Alps, the bloody fields of Cannae, and the bitter sands of Zama. He had fought, he had won, he had lost, but he had never submitted. He knew his death would be a relief to his lifelong enemy. According to the historian Livy, his final words were a testament to his indomitable spirit, laced with a bitter irony aimed at the nation that had hounded him to his end. "Let us," he declared, "free the Romans from their long-standing anxiety, since they find it too long to wait for the death of an old man." With that, he drank the poison. The mind that had conceived the brilliant tactics of Trebia and Lake Trasimene, the will that had sustained an army in hostile territory for over a decade, slowly faded into darkness. Hannibal Barca, the nightmare of Rome, was dead. He died as he had lived, on his own terms, unbowed and unconquered in spirit. His death marked the end of an era. It was the final, tragic chapter in the epic saga of the Punic Wars. Rome had finally vanquished its greatest adversary, not on the battlefield, but through political pressure and betrayal. Yet, in death, Hannibal achieved a different kind of victory. He denied Rome their ultimate prize and cemented his legacy not as a captive, but as the eternal, unconquerable foe who chose his own fate. His story serves as a powerful reminder that even in defeat, dignity and defiance can forge an immortal legend. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating figures. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories from the ancient world, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back. We've journeyed through epic battles, crossed treacherous mountains with elephants, and witnessed the rise and fall of one of history's greatest minds. Now, we arrive at the final chapter. The legacy of a legend. What makes a name echo through millennia? For Hannibal Barca, the answer lies not just in the battles he won, but in how he won them, and the sheer terror he struck into the heart of the world's mightiest republic. Let's step back for a moment. More than 2,000 years have passed since Hannibal's time. Empires have risen and crumbled. Technologies have evolved beyond his wildest imagination. Yet, today, in the most prestigious military academies across the globe, from West Point in the United States to Sandhurst in the UK, cadets are still studying the Battle of Cannae, because Hannibal didn't just win a battle. He perfected the art of war. His double envelopment tactic at Cannae is considered by many historians to be the single most perfect tactical victory in military history. He used his enemies' strengths, their numbers, and their aggression against them. He understood psychology, baiting the Romans into a trap they couldn't see until it was far too late. He didn't just defeat an army. He annihilated it. This wasn't brute force. It was a symphony of strategy, deception, and flawless execution. This single battle became the benchmark, the ideal that commanders for centuries would strive to replicate. But his genius wasn't confined to a single day on the plains of a people. Think about his legendary crossing of the Alps. It was an act of such audacity that it bordered on madness. It had never been done before with such a large, diverse army, let alone with war elephants. He faced avalanches, hostile tribes, and the unforgiving cold. He lost thousands of men and most of his elephants, but he emerged in Italy, appearing where the Romans thought it was impossible. This single act completely upended their strategic calculations. It demonstrated Hannibal's core philosophy: achieve the unexpected, break the rules of conventional warfare, and seize the initiative. It was a masterclass in logistics, leadership, and sheer, indomitable will. Hannibal was also a master of intelligence and counterintelligence. He often disguised himself, mingling with locals in Roman towns to gather information firsthand. He spoke multiple languages and understood the cultures of his diverse mercenary army, which included Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Libyans. How do you lead such a disparate group, Men who owed allegiance only to their pay. For 15 years in hostile territory without a major mutiny. You do it through a combination of respect, fear, and shared success. He paid them on time, fought alongside them in the front ranks, and consistently led them to victory. They weren't just fighting for Carthage, they were fighting for Hannibal. The fear he inspired in Rome was so profound it became a part of their cultural DNA. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a Roman proverb, a warning used for centuries to signify imminent danger. Imagine that, an entire civilization, the most powerful in the Mediterranean, used your name as a boogeyman to scare their children and rally their citizens. He never actually breached the walls of Rome, but in their minds, he was always there, a shadowy threat lurking just over the horizon. This psychological impact is a testament to his effectiveness. He waged war not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of his enemies. Ironically, Hannibal's greatest legacy might be the very empire he sought to dismantle. His relentless pressure on Rome forced it to adapt, innovate, and ultimately, to become stronger. He exposed their military weaknesses, compelling them to reform their legions and their command structure. The rise of Scipio Africanus, the very general who defeated him, was a direct response to the threat Hannibal posed. Rome had to produce its own strategic genius to counter him. In a way, Hannibal was the crucible that forged the Roman military machine that would go on to conquer the known world. Without Hannibal, would Rome have become the empire we remember? It's a fascinating question. His influence didn't end with the Romans. Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of history's most celebrated military minds, considered Hannibal a master of strategy. Napoleon Bonaparte, on his lonely exile in St. Helena, spent countless hours studying and writing about Hannibal's campaigns, dissecting his every move. Napoleon saw a kindred spirit in Hannibal's audacity, his ability to inspire his men, and his strategic vision. Even in the 20th century, generals like George S. Patton and Norman Schwarzkopf drew inspiration from his tactics of rapid movement, deception, and envelopment. So, when we remember Hannibal, we remember more than just a Carthaginian general. We remember an innovator, a leader who turned a mercenary army into a loyal brotherhood. We remember a strategist whose battlefield brilliance is still the gold standard. We remember a man whose audacity challenged the course of history and whose name became immortal, whispered not just in fear by the Romans, but in awe by students of history and warfare for all time. He may have lost the war, but in the grand theater of history, Hannibal Barca achieved a victory that has never faded. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the life of Hannibal. It's been a privilege to explore his story with you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating figures. It truly helps the channel grow. Until next time, stay curious.